3 minutes after 10 is the time. One of the back pages where of course, the sports headlines reside this morning has the headline, "We're not killers." Well, I glanced at it. I presumed it was going to be about the Grand National, but it's not. It is Mikel Arteta, the Arsenal manager, bemoaning his club's lack of what I suppose we'd have to call killer instinct. But we may get back to that Grand National story a little later in the programme. It's an odd one, isn't it? Because I think it probably falls into the category of things that everybody knows is wrong and probably indefensible. All these horses who die, I didn't have much clue of precisely how big the problem was. But it's been going on forever. And people are constantly trying to besiege our traditions and something national trust something. Therefore, you've got to get cross about any suggestion that it probably has no place in the 21st century. Factor in the amount of money that is made from the Grand National by organisations and institutions, and not to mention individuals who are already stinking rich. And I'd suggest that the chances of seeing any meaningful change on that front are pretty slim. Listen, I know I can watch the snooker. Stop messaging. I've been watching the snooker on the red button, on Eurosport. I'm just pointing out normally the World Championship would be on normal telly, as I still call it, showing my age somewhat. It would be on, even the first round would have been on BBC Two, wouldn't it? That's all I was saying, because it occurred to me. The campaign group Republic has accused the BBC of a lack of impartiality in its coverage before the coronation of King Charles, claiming that the broadcaster failed to hold the monarchy to account. But I was also thinking, the conversation we had last week off the back of some research showing that most people or a surprising proportion of people are at best ambivalent. At best ambivalent when it comes to the coronation is possibly the same argument as to why the Beeb doesn't show the snooker in its entirety on BBC Two or even BBC Four. You might hit the red button as you get into the closing stages. And Jack Jones' astonishing performance last night for a debutant, albeit a 29-year-old debutant, one of the best debuts I've ever seen at the Crucible. Absolutely brilliant snooker, but it took me about half a frame to find it on my remote control. You won't be surprised to learn, if you're even passingly familiar with this programme, that we're not going to be talking about any of this for the duration of the rest of this hour. We are instead going to be turning our attention to the NHS in particular. This is a conversation I don't want to have, if you'll allow me a moment of self-indulgence. It's a conversation that you may have detected my reluctance about whenever we're talking about industrial action in particular in the NHS, but also when we are talking about the health service in pretty much any context. And you say to me, "Oh, they're softening it up for privatisation," and I put my hands up and say, I always used to quote. What's his chops? I always used to quote that American academic who says that the classic tradition of privatisation, the classic path towards privatisation, Noam Chomsky, is to defund and demoralise an institution until it reaches such a state that the public will be either quiet or go along to stop sending me messages when I'm trying to concentrate. Mark in Edinburgh says, "You're so unpatriotic, James. I, for one, can't wait to see King Luggy's Spangly Hat Party." Can we close that screen? I'm trying to be serious, for heaven's sake. So Noam Chomsky's model of privatisation, which isn't watertight, it's not absolutely beyond criticism, but it seems to fit. Look at the state, particularly the railways. Remember how we used to talk about British Rail. Probably, if you're a bit younger than me, you may not remember, but it used to be very much a staple of national comedy. You take the mickey out of British Rail, you take the mickey out of the sandwiches, you take the mickey out of everything. And of course, now look at it. Now look at the state of the railways and tell me that it is better for anyone except shareholders, of course, better for anyone involved in the provision of that particular service. And so Chomsky, we must pay attention to Chomsky when he explains that the precursor to privatisation of a previously public property is often defunding, demoralisation, and it's hard to imagine a more complete defunding and demoralisation of a public institution than what's happened to the NHS over the last 13 years. They like to say we're spending more money than ever before. Before anybody knew who I was, but when you were still kind enough to listen to this programme, I was occasionally allowed to interview Conservative politicians. Would you believe it? Even Boris Johnson would appear on the programme, twice, I think, before his advisers at City Hall banned him from ever doing so again. That's not my opinion, by the way. That's counting. That's what the London Evening Standard reported. But I did once interview Ian Duncan Smith, and he said something like, there are more people in work than ever before. And I thought, oh, that sounds good. And then I sort of paused for a moment, and I thought, well, there are more people alive than ever before. The population, the adult population of this country is the highest that it's ever been. These statistics only really matter when you put them in percentage terms. So when they say we're spending more money than ever on the NHS, it's true. But in terms of what they're spending per head of the population, or per capita, if you've got the Latin, well, it's not the case that they're spending more than ever before. And so it's a useful little example, that perhaps, of how there can be lies, damned lies, and statistics. So the NHS is being defunded. It has certainly been demoralised. In 2010, patient satisfaction with the entire service was the higher it has been since records began. Nobody will be surprised to learn that it is now the lowest, I think. And the responsibility for that most categorically does not lie with doctors and nurses, or even with managements. It lies with government. When I tell you that Rishi Sunak just last week suggested that there should be a greater role for the private sector as he set out to how he wanted to win voters' trust on the issue, you probably shouldn't have been surprised. Similarly, today, when the news emerges that 1 in every 8 Britons has paid for private health services in the last year, you probably shouldn't be surprised. Another 27% looked into going private for themselves or a loved one, but decided against it, often because they couldn't actually afford it. You're looking at about 13% of people who did pay for care for themselves or someone that they live with. For the record, I'm not in this category. I haven't done it, but I would. We're at A&E on Saturday night. I'll spare you the details. Nothing too important or hideous. But you get there. It's an hour before you get triaged. It's 4 hours before you can see a doctor. You are aware that some of that will be the aftermath of the doctor's strike, which only ended at 7 o'clock that morning, Saturday morning. But if you'd said to me, give me 200 quid and we'll see you in 20 minutes, I'd have done it. I don't know whether that makes me part of the machine or a tool of capitalist oppression, but you're sitting there with someone you love who's in pain, and you have 200 quid in your pocket or in your bank account, or possibly you've got 2 grand or 20 grand, depending on how rich you are and how much pain your loved one is in. It doesn't seem to me to be particularly difficult to understand how people are going to do it. The point is that for much of my life, there was no point doing it, because all that you benefited from by dint of paying for private healthcare was better accommodation. I've told you a few times that when my dad was on the Daily Telegraph, he got private healthcare as part of his package, his remuneration package, and when he needed an operation in hospital, he got his own room with Sky TV, and we never had Sky TV at home. Not only with Sky TV, but with sandwiches. Like, you could phone up and order sandwiches. That was it. But he didn't get better doctors or better care than he would have done on the NHS, and he didn't get seen any quicker. But he had a more pleasant experience. I've got no particular beef with that. If you want to pay some money to have a fluffier pillows, like at the travel lodge when you can ring downstairs and get a fancy pillow, or you want to pay some extra money to have a bed that I don't know, tips up and down, or a private room, or that what you might call the accoutrements of healthcare. That seems to me to be fairly straightforward. But when you're spending money to jump queues, or to most obviously to jump queues, or to get seen at all when you might not otherwise get seen, it feels very different, doesn't it? So what's the conversation I've been trying to avoid? I noticed yesterday, actually, thinking about what we were going to talk about today. What is the conversation that I've been trying to avoid? Well, it is this one. It is the fact that you often see on the side of ambulances the company that is actually the owner of the ambulance and running that particular corner of the NHS. It is when I get my texts coming into the studio telling me that, large parts of the NHS have effectively already been privatised. I am, as a few of you are already reminding me, speaking mostly now about England, Wales and Northern Ireland. But if you want to bring the Scottish model to the table, then you will, as ever, be more than welcome. But the ambulances with private companies on the side of them, the doctors and nurses who tell me how much of what is done under the roof of the hospital or the surgery in which they work still qualifies as privatised, is already privatised. Rishi Sunak really saying the quiet part out loud last week when he talked about how Tories should not be hung up about making the case for greater private sector involvement to help provide competition in the health service. Don't forget that every time a private sector company provides health care for a member of the public, wherever the money is coming from, some of it will make its way into the pockets of shareholders. That is the bottom line. That is why a certain type of Tory finds the NHS and your local allotments repellent, because nobody rich is making a profit or creaming off the top a little bit of the money that is changing hands. More people now are waiting to start routine hospital treatment than ever before. It's the highest total since records began in 2007. And we learned today that 1 in 8 Britons are already paying for health services. So I have 2 questions for you. The first is, why did you? And I'm absolutely, categorically not here to criticise. I absolutely, categorically would pay for private healthcare myself in the moment. I don't know why. I've never taken out private health insurance or anything like that. I think I might have had it as a perk of the job when I was on the Daily Express, but that was 154 years ago and I was only there for 10 minutes. So I have no beef with it in the moment. Your baby is I mean, you're speaking to a man that took his first child to A&E when she had conjunctivitis because I was so terrified that her little eyes looked so unpleasant. I went to 3 local GPs, all of them were shut, and then I took her to A&E at Hammersmith Hospital where they were very calm, patient and polite with me. So you've got a little child who's in pain and someone says, well, I'll tell you what, give us your PIN number, give us your PIN, and I'll see you right. You do it. You in those circumstances. No beef whatsoever with you. But why did you do it? 0345 6060973. And then the tricky question. And if you're answering the first question, particularly obviously if you find yourself pretty surprised, right, that you have done this. You're surprised that you've done it. Surprised by one of 2 things, possibly both. Surprised that you are the type of person who has now paid for private healthcare in a country where the NHS remains the jewel in the crown of the last 100 years. And the second reason why you are surprised that you have done it is that you didn't realise how much a difference it could make, what the normal level, the base level of NHS care had become. 0345 6060973. You can see what I'm doing, can't you? I'm avoiding the question I don't want to ask you. It's 10:16 now. That's not unduly late by my standards, but it's still about 100 seconds over the mark. And what is the second question? You've probably worked it out already. How far down the road have we already gone? When Rishi Sunak says there should be a greater role for the private sector in the NHS, he is not saying there should be a role for the private sector in the NHS. Now, it's not going to surprise anybody, I don't think. We all knew that they are already playing. The private sector already plays a role in the NHS. But just think about the semantics of that. Prime Minister says there should be a greater role for the private sector in the NHS, a greater role. How big is the role already? I'm not expecting scientific or statistical analysis. I'm just expecting first or second-hand testimony. How big is it already? Have we actually been led down the path to privatisation much further than the average punter realises? The average doctor, nurse, or particularly assiduous health service watcher knows how far down the path we've already gone. But how far down it have we already travelled? And that is the question that I didn't want to ask you. I hope, however, that you fancy answering it. 0345 6060 973. It is 20 minutes after 10. I can't check everything that you send me, okay? But if I do read something out that you think needs challenging, then let's just do it together, all right? You let me know that is not the case, or that is not what actually happens. Louise, for example, is in Bradford. She writes that endometriosis already requires private healthcare if you want to be treated properly. I'm going to have to pay nearly £10,000 for treatment at a specialist centre in London because they don't have any proper specialists outside of London. Morning, James, says Robin Leeds. My wife has an angry mole. Sounds like a cartoon character. That the NHS dermatologist has referred for removal. The NHS waiting list at this point in time is September. Same consultant works for a private company. I have private healthcare through work. Wife was seen by him the next day, scheduled in for removal in the next 2 weeks. That's suspected skin cancer. Delays in the NHS will cost lives. I'm blessed to have the insurance, but it makes me so angry that I have to use it. Just so you know, the 10-minute consultation was £225, if not covered by insurance. And as far as I can tell, this does include people who've got private health insurance rather than people who've just had a sort of one-stop shop type of experience. So 2 questions underway: your story, your experience, and your analysis of how far down the path that Rishi Sunak wants to take us further down has the NHS already travelled. Sophie is in Burgess Hill. Sophie, what can you tell us?
Hi there, James. Thank you for taking my call.
You're very welcome.
I have had huge success in my family on the NHS throughout the decades.
Yeah, me too.
Where my dad wouldn't be alive without the NHS. It saved us an absolute fortune. But unfortunately, I haven't had the same support with my son. He is coming up for 5 years old. And since he started eating solids at 6 or 7 months old, he's had gastro issues. I've been to the GP probably 6 or 7 times since the age of 7 months old.
Right.
They've given me no support. They told me a number of reasons as to why he might have these issues. Never the right one. Okay. Never referred me to a specialist ever. When they did, they decided to send me to a dietitian because we're plant-based. They assumed that it must be something that I'm doing wrong.
Right.
We assumed a gluten intolerance and got sent for testing for celiacs, and then they just dropped the ball after that. We've
tried our possible paths. They don't seem to apply. Yeah. That's it. There's nothing else we can do for you.
2 weeks ago, I decided to just say, that's enough. I've had enough of this. A £200 consultation with a private gastroenterologist has near enough solved my problems.
Oh, my days.
I know.
But, I mean, that gastroenterologist will also be working for the NHS, probably most of the time. Yeah. But the point is you didn't get a referral.
And they refused to refer me.
Well, this is no criticism of you, but you also used up 8 appointments with a GP at a time when waiting lists and the ease of getting an appointment is very, very difficult. I can I ask what was wrong? Do you mind? You've just piqued my curiosity now.
Certainly. He has a fructose malabsorption, so it means that he can't digest a type of sugar called fructose properly.
Oh, gosh. And how long did it take? How long did it take the specialist to pinpoint that?
Really, kind of 40 minutes.
So you tell her, you give him chapter and verse over the phone, was it?
Over the phone. Yeah.
Oh my gosh! Over the phone, chapter and verse, and he says, "Oh, sounds like a fructose absorption issue to me."
Yeah, and then we've got tests booked, but I've already reduced fructose in his diet and seen huge improvements already.
Oh, what a relief for you and him, though, as well.
Elimination diets.
Of course.
I've been through everything. I've been asking to speak to a gastroenterologist for over 2 years. And I finally got referred in January, and I'm still waiting. And I was told by the GP that it would be unlikely to be helpful at all. I mean, I sat in the office and I said, I'm not going anywhere until you refer me.
Did they think that you were a paranoid mum?
They think I'm mad.
Yes.
They think I'm absolutely mad because I like research. I do a lot of research online, and I've come up with all these theories.
Sure.
And I've been through each one, and they just think I'm insane because I've got all these ideas.
Well, vindication is yours, and improvement is his. Briefly, Sophie, and finally, what sort of symptoms was your lad suffering from?
He was bloated. He had difficulty. So there's a Bristol stool chart, and he was always in kind of in the worst areas of that. Yeah. Potty training was really hard. He had a rash across his face.
So all sorts of problems.
All sorts of things. I thought it was food allergies. I thought all sorts. I mean, it's been really
And there it
hard
is.
work.
I mean, this is, in a way, the perfect opening to the conversation, because it sounds like you got unlucky with a GP who is obviously overworked and oversubscribed, and yet at the same time, that £200 is probably the best £200 you've ever spent on a service that you would once have expected to get relatively quickly on the NHS, and which, even when you finally got a referral, as a consequence, it sounds, and I say this as a compliment, of being a squeaky wheel, because we all know it's squeaky wheels that get the most oil, you'd still be sitting there waiting while your lad is suffering. And the reason I have been reluctant to have this conversation is because now already, with Sophie's call, the first call on a supremely important subject, that question has just popped into my head. Is it deliberate? Is this deliberate? The experience, I know the GP is not deliberately palming her off or treating her as if she is mad, but the workload, the waiting lists creates a scenario in which GPs are more likely perhaps to behave like that one did, and therefore less likely to refer children to the specialists that they need, and therefore more likely to prompt the parents who can afford it to pay for it. And then we've gone full Chomsky. Claire is in Newham. Claire, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi James,
Hello,
good to speak to you. Yeah, well, sadly I have been forced to turn to private health because the NHS has really let me down. So I was quite suspicious of the NHS anyway, and it's not because of the people in it. I purely blame the government, but
Right.
Both of my parents died in and around the pandemic because I think that they just weren't seen to. It was my dad who was diagnosed with lung cancer before the pandemic,
Right.
and he died within a couple of months because there was no treatment that quickly. And then my mum died within the pandemic in January 2021, and there was no ambulance for her when she had a stroke. And that was,
I nearly jumped in. I'm trying to jump in a bit less than that.
Okay.
But when you use the word forced
Yeah.
to go private, or because I nearly jumped in and said, oh, really? Is that the right? But it is the right word to use, isn't it?
Yeah, so basically I then had a COVID infection in March 2022, and it's triggered a condition in me, which I've now since been diagnosed as vestibular migraines. But basically, every single day I've been dizzy since then, so that's over a year. I have frequent headaches, and it's just gotten worse. I have some mega migraines, which are like a week and a half at a time, which is like a knife stabbing in my head.
And at risk of hurrying you, because I'm just conscious of the news, what happened?
Sure.
I mean, the NHS didn't help, so you decided
I was pushed from pillar to post, waiting.
Well, they didn't even acknowledge the existence of long COVID for quite a long time, although they do now. But what, and related issues, what happened when you phoned up a private health company?
I had the full works of diagnostic testing, and then I was referred to a private balance physio who has then helped, but then I've kind of had relapses, so then I've seen a private neurologist, and I'm just about to start on another course of tablets to see if that helps. But yeah, it's been in a vastly quicker time frame than it was.
How much have you spent?
Fortunately, my partner has actually private healthcare insurance through his company, so it's like £80 a month, and then I've had to spend another like £200 on a MRI as well to kind of jump the queue then, because it had been months. I tried my best to go with the NHS, but it was just months, and I was in so much pain.
And that's why you use the word forced when you rang in. I hope things get better soon, Claire. I really do. Just sometimes the sense that people are actually trying to help can be a huge benefit, as opposed to the sense that they haven't got the time or occasionally the inclination. Every caller will be at pains to stress that they do not hold individual or doctors and nurses in general responsible for their negative experiences. You may well, like any profession, there are even radio presenters, I'm told, who aren't very nice if you encounter them privately, and doctors and nurses can be exactly the same. No profession is uniformly populated by pleasant people or even professionals or even good, talented, well-meaning people, but there is no beef here with doctors and nurses. Quite the contrary. I nearly used the royal we there, but I can't speak for everybody listening. I can simply tell you that I am fully supportive of the unfolding industrial action, even though it made my life measurably worse on Saturday night. 10:30 is the time. Thomas Watts is here with your headline. Okay, I'm going to find this quite difficult. I have to tell you that. And I promise we will return to the conversation about the NHS and privatisation imminently and give it the attention it deserves. But given that it was just in Thomas's news bulletin, I feel I should talk about Vladimir Kara-Murza, who, would you believe, is a friend of mine. Genuinely a friend of mine, and who has been sentenced this morning to 25 years in a Russian jail for, I can't swear, treason. He's one of the bravest men I've ever met. He's been poisoned by Putin on numerous occasions. His criticism of the war in Ukraine is also a cause of his incarceration. Latest in a number of Vladimir Putin's opponents to have been arrested or forced to flee Russia. He went back to say, I'll tell you what I'm going to do, actually, if I can hold it together. I'm going to read you what he said to the court in Moscow last week. I only blame myself for one thing. I failed to convince enough of my compatriots and politicians in democratic countries of the danger that the current Kremlin regime poses for Russia and for the world. For me, as a historian, this is cause for reflection. Criminals are supposed to repent of what they have done. I, on the other hand, am in prison for my political views. I also know that the day will come when the darkness over our country will dissipate. Prosecute murderers and criminals rather than honest and responsible citizens who dare to think and speak the truth. This is a letter sent by dozens of Russian journalists and rights activists calling on the authorities to free Kara-Murza, stop Russia's new slide towards Stalinism and a totalitarian system. And I've known him, you won't be surprised to learn, as a consequence of my friendship with Bill Browder, who first appeared on this programme because he was listening in the back of a taxi while we tried in our clumsy and ill-informed way to start talking about Russian politics. Bill has dedicated his life to seeking justice for his former lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who died in a Russian jail as a consequence of Putin's kleptocratic cronies stealing hundreds of millions of pounds, and the Magnitsky Foundation set up in Sergei's memory is the context in which I have met Vladimir and his wife on a number of occasions. And it's mad that, because I sit here in front of you every day, and I overshare. I tell you stuff that sometimes you might think I probably shouldn't have told you, and I know I can be a bit of a wombat sometimes, and I get a bit overexcited about meeting interesting people, but I've never had that before. They've tried to kill him already. And he went back to speak up for what he believes to be true, to speak up for his country and his compatriots. And now they've sentenced him to 25 years in a Russian jail. And it was, of course, in a Russian jail where Sergei Magnitsky got so poorly, having been beaten and mistreated in various ways, that he ultimately died. So that's why allowing London to become a playground for Putin's billionaire mates is so disgusting. That's why putting people in prominent positions in British society, up to and including the House of Lords, looking at you, Boris Johnson, is so enraging. That's why the failure to properly reveal the extent of that infiltration and indeed the possible interference in democratic processes in this country by Putin's regime is so disgusting. And it's why the failure of huge majorities of the British media, with some glorious and honourable exceptions, to even begin to try to understand the scale of this issue is so shaming. They tried to kill him at least twice. In the same way, more or less, that they tried to kill Alexander Litvinenko or the Skripals. I always say the name Dawn Sturgis at this point because we always talk about how they failed to kill the Skripals, but they did kill Dawn Sturgis, a completely innocent woman. And now they've put Vladimir in jail for 25 years. So it's not just the usual toing and froing and Tory bashing when we talk about Russia on this programme, or when we talk about the fact that Evgeny Lebedev, the Lord of Richmond and Siberia, who Boris Johnson put in the House of Lords after essentially dismissing advice from the Appointments Committee. His father is currently the man who's made the money that Lebedev has used to buy the newspapers in this country and to advance through the upper echelons of high society in Britain. He is currently sanctioned by the Canadian government for being and I more or less quote, a key member of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. But here, anyway, yeah. I might read you his entire statement a little later, but my goodness me, that's rather knocked me sideways today. 10:40 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we return our attention to the state of our NHS, the fact that 1 in 8 Brits are already paying for health services. Rishi Sunak makes no secret of the fact that he wants even more of us to do so. There should be a greater role for the private sector. Pretty easy after the first 2 or 3 calls to understand why people have chosen to go down that path. But I'm interested also, and I'm a bit of a victim of my own success on this one, because everyone's ringing in to tell me their answers to the first question, and I need some phone lines to answer the second question, which is how far down this path have we already gone? Perhaps without most of us properly understanding or appreciating the encroaching, the state, the success of the encroaching privatisation. Because Sunak's not saying that he wants a role for the private sector in the NHS. He's saying that he wants an even greater role. Dave is in Stratford-upon-Avon. Dave, what would you like to say?
James, love the show. Thanks for having me on. A lengthy career in the NHS in procurement. Outsourcing clinical services has been a bigger and bigger part of the job that I've now retired from. So I can speak as not being an employee of the NHS anymore. So for me, the turning point was Andrew Lansley's 2012 Health and Social Care Act, and that really set the scene for marketisation, contestability, and a greater place for private sector to come in. It never happened. There were bits and bobs that were done. There was bits at the edges, and all we've seen since is really just tinkering at the edges. Now, my theory is that there's not enough money in healthcare in this country. So you look at the GDP spend. It's pretty low.
The per capita in particular, isn't it? It's or the percentage of GDP or the per capita. So they can say we're spending more money than ever before, which is a bit like Boris Johnson claiming that we had better growth than any other country, which, while it may have been technically true, the full truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth was that these situations were actually evidence of bad stuff, not good stuff.
So it's really difficult for them to make a profit, and it's really difficult to squeeze it out. And of course, if you've got characters like me, the other side of complex contracts, complex pay mechanisms, and really strict KPIs, deductions and penalties, it becomes even more difficult. Now, the last job I did, ironically, was to sort out a patient pathway, which I won't talk about because it'll be quite obvious where it is. That bizarrely, my wife in the next shire up has had exactly the same issue. Now, where I was, we had to spend close on £2 million to put right that clinical pathway, and that was down to a number of issues, COVID being one of them.
So we're looking at profligacy and incompetence, which are particular problems in the public sector because nobody's head rolls when something goes wrong. I mean, that in the private sector you would at least lose your job. In the public sector you probably get sent on a course. I know I'm being a bit lazy there intellectually, but I'm conscious of the time. How deliberate is the drive towards what Rishi Sunak describes as a greater role for the private sector? Not looking forward, but looking back over your career.
I just don't see it. Lansley gave it a real good go, and it fell flat on his face. It was an absolute disaster. And there's nothing I can see as I've exited the NHS and dealing with people at the Department of Health, NHS.
But you must have seen a heck of a lot more private sector involvement in the NHS at the end of your career than you did at the beginning.
I did, James, but it's about propping up, and it was about sticking plaster and making.
Yeah, but that's kind of the point. That's why I think we're possibly slightly at cross purposes. That's the whole point. That's Chomsky's model: is that you make it so bad you need the private sector to come in.
And I agree, James.
Well, that's deliberate then.
But can we actually find somebody at the Department of Health? Do we actually know there's somebody that's hatching this devious plan, or are they just doing the let's reduce?
Well, that's the question, but or somewhere between the two. I mean, you can't look at the spending figures that you referred to at the beginning, or the collapse in patient satisfaction, the exponential explosion, frankly, of waiting list times. There'll be other factors as well, but there must be apathy on the part of the politicians in charge of it, at least apathy on the part of them, in a way that...
Yeah, I agree.
Because looking at cock-up or conspiracy, I'll give you 52% cock-up, 48% conspiracy, but the cock-up could be part of the conspiracy.
It could be, and I'm not close enough to the thought processes that determine
I want you
that.
to be right, by the way. I want you to be right.
Yeah. I look for evidence, and I've not seen it, and I've not seen
except the fact that the private sector involvement in the NHS at the end of your career was immeasurably greater than it was at the beginning of your career. So that's the bit where I bow to your greater experience. But from the outside, with Noam Chomsky in my back pocket, that's exactly how it happens. That's precisely how it unfolds. The time is 10:46. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. It is 10:49, and I'm not joking when I say that sometimes, that too many people are ringing in to answer the first question I asked, so I can't get anyone answering the second. Just to really get on your nerves, I'm going to ask you a third question now as well. And after I've asked you a third question, because we'll definitely carry this on after the 11 o'clock, there are a few more important issues facing the country today, then... we will return to it, but I'm also going to read you Vladimir Kara-Murza's full statement to the Moscow City Court last Monday, because this Monday he has been sentenced to 25 years in jail for treason, which is, and if I was working in Russia, I wouldn't be able to say this. It's an absolute travesty. It's a mockery of justice. It's obscene. It's obscene that the language, man. A courageous patriot who Vladimir Putin is not fit to lace the boots of has been sent to jail for 25 years. I want to read you that statement in full, because I can't do more. But the third question on the NHS conversation is how you feel listening to this, because I could take calls now until tea time from people who have, to use the word of an earlier caller, felt forced to go private. How do you feel as someone who knows you couldn't afford to? Because that's the point. That's why this is a politically hot potato. There's no particular problem to paying a little bit to get seen a bit quicker until you remember that means someone else gets seen a bit slower. Not directly. It's not arithmetic, but more and more consultants or more and more healthcare professionals do more and more shifts for the private sector, in addition usually to what they're doing in the NHS, but some make the move completely. They've been trained, of course, within the NHS or overseas, but if you're talking about people trained here, they will have been trained within the NHS, and then they move across to the profit-making parts of healthcare provision. But it is pretty hard to see how the increase in people paying for private care is not to the detriment of people who can't. So how do you feel as someone who knows you can't afford it and knows that miracles notwithstanding you never will be able to afford it? How do you feel about the idea of thousands of people feeling that they have no choice but to spend money to get health care when you do not have that choice at all? We'll get back to that imminently. But first, this is what Vladimir said to the Moscow City Court. And I have to tell you that history is punctuated with astonishing speeches. I nearly read this to you in its entirety last week, and I'm embarrassed that I didn't. But, you know, events overtake us, and we weren't going to talk about the issues in a phone-in context, so I didn't read it to you, and I wish that I had. But in many ways, it carries even more weight now, because he would have known what was on the horizon when he said this to Moscow City Court. He would have known exactly what writing was on the wall, and he would have known how this speech would be greeted by the court. Members of the court, I was sure, after 2 decades spent in Russian politics, after all that I have seen and experienced, that nothing can surprise me anymore. I must admit that I was wrong. I've been surprised by the extent to which my trial, in its secrecy and its contempt for legal norms, has surpassed even the trials of Soviet dissidents in the 1960s and 70s. And that's not even to mention the harshness of the sentence requested by the prosecution, or the talk of enemies of the state. In this respect, we've gone beyond the 1970s, all the way back to the 1930s. For me, as a historian, this is an occasion for reflection. At one point during my testimony, the presiding judge reminded me that one of the extenuating circumstances was remorse for what the accused has done. And although there is little that's amusing about my present situation, I could not help smiling. The criminal, of course, must repent of his deeds. I'm in jail for my political views, for speaking out against the war in Ukraine, for many years of struggle against Vladimir Putin's dictatorship, for facilitating the adoption of personal international sanctions under the Magnitsky Act against human rights violators. Not only do I not repent of any of this, I am proud of it. I am proud that Boris Nemtsov brought me into politics, and I hope that he is not ashamed of me. I subscribe to every word that I have spoken and every word of which I have been accused by this court. I blame myself only for one thing: that over the years of my political activity, I have not managed to convince enough of my compatriots and enough politicians in the democratic countries of the danger that the current regime in the Kremlin poses for Russia and for the world. Today, this is obvious to everyone, but at a terrible price: the price of war. In their last statements to the court, defendants usually ask for an acquittal. For a person who has not committed any crimes, acquittal would be the only fair verdict. But I do not ask this court for anything. I know the verdict. I knew it a year ago when I saw people in black uniforms and black masks running after my car in the rearview mirror. Such is the price for speaking up in Russia today. But I also know that the day will come when the darkness over our country will dissipate, when black will be called black and white will be called white, when at the official level it will be recognized that 2 times 2 is still 4, when a war will be called a war and a usurper, and when those who kindled and unleashed this war, rather than those who tried to stop it, will be recognized as criminals. This day will come as inevitably as spring follows even the coldest winter. And then our society will open its eyes and be horrified by what terrible crimes were committed on its behalf. From this realization, from this reflection, the long, difficult but vital path toward the recovery and restoration of Russia, its return to the community of civilized countries, will begin. Even today, even in the darkness surrounding us, even sitting in this cage, I love my country and believe in our people. I believe that we can walk this path. That's the words last week of Vladimir Kara-Murza, my friend, who knew full well that the sentence handed down today, 25 years for treason, was on the way. Find out more about that actually. If you ever do one thing for me as a consequence of listening to this programme, just find out more about Vladimir, find out more about Sergei Magnitsky, and find out more about this story. I will resist the urge to reflect once again upon the relationship between David Cameron and Boris Johnson's Conservative Party and the kind of people who have put Vladimir Kara-Murza where he is today. And when he said cage, by the way, that's literal. He's in a cage in a courtroom in Moscow. It's not a figure of speech. It's not referring to the prison cell that he's taken back to. He's in a cage. He was in a cage. It's coming up to 10:59. It's a little bit unfair on Chris in Chelmsford, but hey ho, it's my train set. Chris in Chelmsford, steer us back to the NHS and tell us why you picked up the phone.
Hi, James. Well, that was so powerful, mate, and I know it's a mate of yours, so my thoughts are with you.
Right, him. Cheers.
Right, NHS. The principle that I'm worried about is that people on lower incomes are being priced out of healthcare. The NHS was set up as a point for, people that are rich have always had access to private healthcare. It was the NHS that brought the concepts of healthcare for everybody. Right now, the outcome for someone with the angry mole situation, if you're on 25 grand a year, you get skin cancer. If you're on 45, 50 grand a year, you get it taken out, you don't have skin cancer. That is selection by income. And that means outcome for health is based on income.
How much? You're right.
It's crazy.
No, I think you're right, and that is, of course, the great fear, and it's why I always refer back to the difference once when I was younger of it being, you got sandwiches, a private room, and Sky TV in your hospital room, but you didn't get an epic difference in treatment. So we're living in a very, very different world. How much of it do you think is deliberate? How much of it do you think has pushed us? What's going on here? Right. Cock-up conspiracy, combination of both, or when Rishi Sunak says there should be a greater role for the private sector in the NHS, is he actually telling us exactly what's going on and just hoping that we won't join all of the dots?
Fundamentally, they don't think they can afford to pay for the NHS in the future. They think that the growth in terms of people will make it not a viable option, and as such, they're doing things to I
don't know. It's never not going to exist, is it? But it's going to. The big fear would be that it becomes a real bargain basement for the people who can't afford to go any better. I think you're right. I've got to crack on, Chris, because of the news. Not your fault, it's mine. But you understand why. It's 11 o'clock. It's 4 minutes after 11, and I think you can see why I have been reluctant to have this conversation previously, can't you? The very simple question of whether or not the NHS has already gone so far down the road towards, a very large role for the private sector, which Rishi Sunak last week called for an even larger role, an even greater role for the private sector, while most of us haven't noticed. Time perhaps to hear from he's here, to hear from the opposition. The Shadow Secretary of State for Health, Wes Streeting, is here today. You're here chiefly, Wes, to talk a little bit more about the pledge for thousands more GPs. You've got a figure of 3 million patients seeing their GP practice close.
That's right, James. I mean, it's bad enough as it is today that so many patients are faced with an 8 a.m. scramble generation of doctors coming in. So we've got to focus on retention, yes, keeping the existing workforce we've got. We can't afford to lose them. And I think that's at a broader NHS challenge at the heart of the risk around strikes. But we've also got to make sure that we recruit. And one of my frustrations is that every year we're seeing thousands of straight A students turned away from studying medicine at university because the number of places is capped at 7,500. We would actually double that number to 15,000, which is what the NHS has asked for. And we would do that by abolishing the non-dom tax status, which the Prime Minister knows all about. And we would therefore both provide great opportunities for bright young people to go into medicine, but also make sure we're training up the next generation of doctors we need so that patients can get seen on time.
When one of my kids was young, she got 20 quid off her grandma for her birthday, and she spent it, I can't remember what on. And then she sort of regretted it, and she asked if she could spend it again. I sometimes wonder whether the abolition of the non-dom tax status is beginning to sound a little bit like that, Wes Streeting. Is that money's going to be uniquely and specifically directed at training doctors, is it?
Let me reassure you, James. abolishing the non-dom tax status raises just over £3 billion a year. 1.6 billion of that is going on the biggest expansion of NHS staff training in history. And then the other half of that is going on providing free primary school breakfast clubs in every primary school. So there's two things that come from the non-dom money, despite what the Tories say. But we're being quite beady-eyed about.
It's not
how we raise and spend money.
I understand, but it's not necessarily three melons on a fruit machine, is it? Because some of these people could withdraw entirely from the British society. I appreciate the most obvious examples. It'd be hard for someone who owns a daily newspaper, for example, who is married to the actual Prime Minister to up sticks and go somewhere else if they were required to do this. But there'll be plenty of other people who could. So you can't guarantee that figure, can you?
Well, we based our work on independent research that was done by academics at Warwick University and the London School of Economics, and we feel confident that the money would be there to fund those two commitments.
What about the money for junior doctors?
Well, let's see where the government get to on that. I mean, a good starting point would be just to get around the table and talk to them. And I've been sort of slightly pulling my hair out in recent weeks at the accusations and counter accusations between the government and the BMA about who's putting blocks and preconditions for the talks. As far as I understand it, what the junior doctors have said is that if our pay had kept up in line with inflation, we are due a 35% pay increase to compensate us. Now, I've been honest about the fact that if I was in government today, that we wouldn't be able to find a 35% pay increase overnight, but we'd be willing to talk. And what the junior doctors seem to be saying is, look, let's sit around the table and talk. This is our position. This is our starting point. Let's sit down and talk to the government. And the government's refusing. And remember, the government did this with the nurses before Christmas. In fact, the Royal College of Nursing and Unison said before Christmas they would call off the strike action before it happened if the government would sit down and talk. The government refused, offered all sorts of excuses and reasons why they were refusing to talk. The strikes happened. The public support held strong. The resolve of the nurses remained strong. And the government had to tuck their tail between their legs and get to the negotiating table. But only after the cancellation of hundreds of thousands of operations, huge disruption to patients, and I think reflected in the RCN result just the other day.
Well, yeah, but not in the
real sense of offence calls to the nursing profession.
Not in the Unison result.
Underpaid but undervalued.
You can't cherry pick like that, can you?
Unison. I think it's a fair point to say Unison have accepted the deal, one thing I would say about the sentiment, though, which I think applies whether people voted for the deal or not, is that I think the nurses and now certainly the junior doctors feel not just underpaid but undervalued by the government, and they don't feel like they've been shown basic respect in terms of a willingness to at least sit down and negotiate. And that's why I've been very upfront with the nurses and the junior doctors. I think honesty is the best policy in saying, look, I can't meet your headline pay demands straight away if I'm the health secretary today. But look back at what the last Labour government did. We delivered year-on-year pay increases and investment into the health service. We actually delivered full pay restoration under the last Labour government because, unsurprisingly, the previous Tory government had also kept people's pay down. And we did that by growing the economy. And that's why when Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer pop up on the TV or the radio talking about economic growth, it's not just for the benefit of some clever city analysts who watch the numbers and the markets and get a thrill out of seeing the numbers going in the right direction. It's because this actually affects our everyday life for everyone in our country in terms of the value of our wages, the prices on the shelves, the value of our mortgages, the affordability of rents. All of this is linked to the health of the economy, and that's why we want to get the economy growing again, so we can invest in public services without having to hike up taxes on working people who frankly just can't afford it, with taxes at the highest level in 70 years.
Okay. Is this a bit where I ask you whether or not you support the industrial action of the Royal College of Nursing and the British Medical Association, and you lead me on a merry dance without saying yes or no?
No, I think I'll be a bit more straightforward about that. I don't want the strikes to go ahead. I am worried about the impact for patients, and I am saying to the RCN that, I totally understand why nurses feel the way they do, and I know that taking strike action for them, as with all workers who go on strike, is always a last resort. And I don't want, I'm not trying to give them a hard time. I don't blame them for this situation at all. But I am really worried that the Royal College of Nursing have said that they won't do what they did before, which is provide emergency cover for things like cancer care, intensive care, emergency medicine. I'm really, really frightened about that.
What would you do then? Because essentially you've explained their position as one with which the government won't engage. The last round of industrial action didn't include the escalation that you've just criticised, but it didn't work. So if you were leading the Royal College of Nursing, Wes Streeting, what would you do in order to get the government to the table?
I'm appealing to them and to the.
No, I'm asking you what you would do.
Well,
because either you support the strike or you don't. You haven't really answered that question, but let's move instead to the question of what you would do as leader of the Royal College of Nursing. If you're criticising their tactics in the next stage of industrial action, what would you do instead?
I would provide emergency cover as they did before. I think that is the.
So you'd stick with the tactics that are failing.
Yeah, I'm absolutely not. I'm absolutely not criticising people who've taken the last resort of going out to strike. I understand why they're in that position. I put the blame and the responsibility squarely at the door of the government. I don't think this is the fault of junior doctors.
No,
I don't
but
think
you would stick with the tactics that are failing. Under your own analysis, they're failing.
I think it's, well, just bear in mind, they got the government to the negotiating table, which the government refused to do. They got an offer that they put to their members. Some unions are voting for it. Obviously, RCM members haven't, and I understand that. They have also managed, against the hope and expectation of the Tories, to keep the support of the public, who I think absolutely have their hearts with the nurses, and so I don't think that the unions involved in the industrial action in the NHS have somehow failed. Quite the opposite. They are forcing the government to negotiate, and it is a reminder of this is why, unfortunately, when people are forced into strike action, it is a legitimate thing for workers to do to withdraw their labour, because it does sometimes force employers, when they're being unreasonable, to get to the table. The government have been unreasonable. In the case of the nurses, they've been forced to the table. In the case of the junior doctors, I suspect they will be forced to the table. And one thing I'd just say to Rishi Sunak, and who's been absent completely from this, he's doing a speech on maths today when they've got a big crisis in the NHS. Steve Barclay has been completely missing altogether. I'd just say to both of them, this is not about political one-upmanship between the government and the unions. This is about the risk of these really valuable people not just walking out of the NHS for another day of strike action, but walking out of the NHS altogether. We cannot afford to lose these doctors and nurses. They are the difference between life and death for patients, and they've got to be treated with respect. I think junior doctors and nurses know that their headline pay demands aren't going to be met overnight. I think they know that, but what they would like to do is to sit down with a government that treats them with respect and is willing to negotiate with them, hear their concerns, and look at what else they can do to improve their lives at work. Because in the case of junior doctors, for example, it's not just that their pay is poor today, it's that their career progression opportunities are more limited than they should be. So a lot of them are really anxious about the fact they can't even progress into the consultant roles or the GP roles that many of them aspire to.
It's a big job. 1 in 8 Britons, final question, paying for health services at the moment. Would you expect that number to come down under Labour?
It did last time, and that's because we made the NHS so good that people didn't feel the need to go private, and that's where I want to be. Again, I'm really worried, James, that we've got a two-tier healthcare system in this country where those who can afford it are paying to go private, and those who can't are being left behind. That's not what the NHS is about. That's not the way we've done healthcare in this country for most of the last 75 years. And I just say to people out there, you can judge the Tories on their record of 13 years in government now, longest waiting times, highest waiting lists, and lowest patient satisfaction ever. Compare that with Labour, the lowest waiting times, the highest patient satisfaction on record, and staff who were paid fairly and treated well. That's where we want to get back to, but that change will only come with a Labour government, and people can send that message to the Conservatives on May the 4th in the local elections.
11:16 is the time. Wes Streeting, Shadow Secretary of State for Health. Many thanks indeed for your time this morning. I for the record, should say I'm always happy to talk to senior politicians. If Steve Barclay ever fancies a chat, then I'm sure we could even sort out some biscuits. Wes Streeting will be with Sheila for a phone-in on LBC on Thursday at 2 p.m. if you want to put your question directly to the Shadow Health Secretary. And I can tell from my inbox that a lot of you, I always take it as a mild criticism when you say, ask him this and ask him that. I'm thinking, what do you think my job is? I don't turn up at your place of work and say, try giving that one a twist. Or maybe stick some of that in there. Or maybe have you thought about doing it that way round? But I take your point. There were a few questions that I didn't ask. So why don't you ask him yourself when he is on LBC with Sheila Fogarty on Thursday from 2. It's 11:16. It is 20 minutes after 11. A couple more calls on the NHS and then we will regroup and decide what we're going to talk about next. The question that perhaps intrigues me most on a personal and professional level is how far down the path towards privatisation we have already gone. And I felt that was a good answer, actually, from Wes Streeting. The point about seeking a reduction in the number of people paying for health services, privately, I should add. We all pay for health services, essentially, don't we, except children in the context of the NHS. But paying for health services privately, if you looked at their record in government, you would expect it to come down under Labour. And also a quick word, he won't be listening, will he? Just let me check something with the producer. He'll be doing a round of interviews, will he? He won't have us on in the car. He'll be talking to someone else now, will he? Yeah. So here's what you must listen out for in politician interviews. I don't get to do many anymore, but the end of and he does it, actually, fair play to him. No, not as much as I would like personally, but partly because this isn't the BBC and, well, it's not one of those shows where, here's a guest and here's another guest and here's a guest and another guest. It's basically just you and me most days, unless there's someone really interesting or important around, and then we'll get them on. So I can more or less take as long as I want. I did an interview with Nigel Farage once when his PR had to come into the studio and drag him out because he kept soiling himself live on the radio. But that's a conversation for a different day. When they've got a 3-minute slot or a 4-minute slot on a show, they can talk, they can answer one question and just keep talking. And you can sound a bit rude. And sometimes people will say, why do you interrupt so much? But with Streeting then, you could hear he did finish sentences and then wait for the next question, which a lot of politicians don't do. And it's not unique to any particular party. Some do it, some don't. I just thought it was worth noting, worth pointing out to you. I should also add that he has been a guest on Full Disclosure, my long-form interview podcast series, which is available on Global Player for free. Download Global Player, the Global Player app, and you can hear all of my Full Disclosure interviews, including this week's, which is with Susie Eddie Izzard. And the one before, which was with Hugh Laurie. How far back do you think I could go on memory of remembering the recent guests on Full Disclosure? Would that be fun? I don't think I could get that far. What was the one before Hugh Laurie? Was it Lucy Easthope? You don't know either, do you? Are there any professionals working on this team today? Keith, put your hand down. It is 22 minutes after 11. Back to the NHS. Addy is in Birmingham. Addy, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I just wanted to sort of give a perspective from a junior doctor who's just come out of the medical training.
Yes.
It's just really disheartening to see, whilst at university it's seen as the almighty NHS is amazing,
yeah.
And you can really feel it. You learn about what you need to do in the timely fashion that it needs to be done, and you go into the NHS, you go into training, and you think, right, I'm going to come across this issue and I'm going to know what to do. Obviously, in certain circumstances, that doesn't happen. But when you go in, my first few weeks were really, really, really difficult because I could see that these patients needed something done.
Yeah.
And there was just no way of it being done.
Yeah.
You could tell they needed a certain type of scan. Fine, we'll try and we'll get that done. We'll get that ordered. But unfortunately, it seems like unless somebody is extremely, extremely unwell, that process is going to take time, and it's really difficult to sort of experience. I'm really sorry. It does get to me.
Don't apologise. What you're describing is the reality of the situation within the NHS, which doctors, you as a junior doctor, find heartbreaking, I think is the word I'd reach for.
It really is.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've moved in back with my parents, and they've literally seen me.
Oh,
and they had to sit me down after the first month and said, "Look, how are things at work? Your whole personality's changed." And I get that. You do need to have a certain shell. You do need to have that certain distance between yourself and the patient, because you need to objectively,
of course,
treat these people.
Yeah. And you can't take them all home and look after them, however much you might want to.
But you do. That's the issue. Like you will just come back and think, oh, God, this person should be going home. But unfortunately, we've had to keep them because we need to make sure that social care is in place, or that they needed to have these types of tests done. But if they go into the community, unfortunately, it's so distressing in community as well that it might take a few months before this happens.
What I'm hearing, oddly, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I imagine that the worst bits of being a doctor are tolerable because you can at least console yourself with the knowledge that you did your best. But what you are describing to me is the relatively swift realization post-qualification that the system doesn't really allow you to do your best, Addy.
No, unfortunately. And I absolutely love what I'm doing.
Good.
And I could not think of anything else. I mean, it's like you go through 4 days of absolute hell, and then on the 5th day where you think, right, I'm gonna go abroad, I'm gonna do something else where I feel valued. You get that patient who comes in and says, "Thank you so much," and that's what makes you think, you know what, whatever, let's crack on. It's going to be a new week. Let's go through it.
Well, we can all be that patient. I'm not speaking to you now. I'm speaking to everybody else. We can all be that patient. We can all make that difference if we do find ourselves in those sort of scenarios. But you paint a pretty bleak picture. How many of your pals, your sort of cohort from medical school, have or are contemplating heading elsewhere, heading overseas? Is it a big deal now in your sort of conversations?
It is. It completely is. A lot of 4 of my close friends are already. 2 of them have put in applications, and they're going for interviews soon. The other 2 are getting in the process of sorting their visas out to go to Australia. One of them wants to go to Canada. Yeah. It's just that the thing is that they just feel more valued there, and it's the same job wherever you go. A heart attack in a country is the same thing as it is anywhere else in the world. The treatment will effectively be the same. It's just that the fact that you're able to actually do something, like instead of just being almost like a helpless bystander, just watching this person deteriorate from day to day, because unfortunately we don't have things, we're not able to actually do anything for them. And I think if we kept staff on, if we're able to solve that issue, then I firmly believe that we wouldn't be in this situation. That's pretty much most of it.
I hear you, and I know you're probably a bit frazzled at the best of times these days. What did you think of Wes Streeting's words a moment ago, if anything?
I thought they were very, very carefully chosen. It was quite. I mean, I understand the sentiment. I know that you can't commit to something on air like that straight away. You need to go through. You need to do the maths. You need to work everything out. But I'm hoping, and certainly a lot of my peers are hoping, that we can see a change in the near future that would just shift the balance towards making the NHS great again, for want of a better word. I really hate saying making things great again, because
it's been polluted by our orange friend with the little hands.
Absolutely. But I mean, you go to anywhere in the world and everybody wants to emulate the NHS.
But that's why the opening of your call was so jarring for me, because you were like that until you started, and you've been fairly shocked, I think, by the reality on the ground. But it's been unravelled over the course of the last 13 years. There is no reason why it can't be ravelled up again, is there? We have to hope that. You especially have to hope that. Otherwise, you'll be following your mates to Australia.
Absolutely. Or in a different profession. I've got. I mean, my if it wasn't for my missus, who loves her parents so much, we'd be on the first flight to Australia.
Yeah, I can understand why, and I hear this from a lot of doctors. I mean, who can argue? You've got. really. If you just want to feel valued, there's the word. There are two types of value, which Addy just beautifully illustrated. There is, of course, the obvious financial remuneration, but there is also feeling valued by patients, if not by politicians, ideally by both. Thank you, Addy, mate, and let me be the person today who says thank you to you very directly and very personally for what you do on behalf of all of the patients that you look after or try to help. It is coming up to 11:30. There are two stories in front of us today, Rishi Sunak's mathematics and the Grand National. I will take an executive decision while Thomas Watts brings you the headlines over which one of those issues we will address together next. Messages for Addy, I think. I'll read a couple of them out. Don't give up, fella. The public... I thought this one was for me first. So don't give up, fella. The public do love you. I thought, yeah, I know. You don't need to tell. But then he adds, and the NHS. So that must have been for Addy. And similarly, hats off to that junior doctor, James. You've just had the one you've just had on. I would rather receive treatment from somebody like that who I feel is in the job because they really care than from a private practitioner who potentially sees me as an invoice to be paid. I take your point, although remember the private practitioner will be working in the NHS as well, almost certainly. So it's not really a fair comparison. Should we do the horses? Gary's been in touch. He says, "Do the horses." Should we do the horses? I don't want to do this like a kind of colour by numbers phone in. Should the Grand National be banned? I'm interested in the mental contortions that we undertake to defend it, because obviously it should be banned. Don't wait. If you really care about animals, because so many of them die. Depending on what figures you're following, there are reportedly 36 horses that have died at the Grand National Festival since 2010. That's more than just the race, because the horse that died yesterday, the 10-year-old gelding that died yesterday, was the third horse to die at the 3-day festival. Dark Raven and Envoy preceded Hill 16 in that grisly context. And Animal Rising, the organisation behind yesterday's protests, said that more than 49 horses had died at UK horse racing events this year alone. So we can't do the silly old colour by numbers phone in, can we? Because that would involve you refusing to admit that you don't care about the 49 dead horses. But I know that you do. So what I really want is... And I don't think anyone's going to do this. We better clear the board, actually. My apologies to everyone waiting to talk about the NHS situation, but we will return to that, I think, with the possible exception of Brexit. We're going to return to that more than any other subject in the coming months and years. But what I'm really interested in on this, and I suffer from cognitive dissonance, right, on this issue more than any others. It took me actually writing a book, or at least one chapter of a book, to work out why I was such that was close, why I was such a wally, why I was such a wazzock when it came to the question of vegetarianism and veganism. You know, some people have aneurysms when Greggs release a vegan sausage roll, and you sort of think, well, why? How can anyone be that pathetic? And then you sort of think, well, hang on, mate, you used to be a bit like that, so why don't you work out why? And the answer is a sort of weird combination of guilt and arrogance. So I am not a vegetarian, but I recognise on some level internally that that eating meat is indefensible. Simon Amstell's film, I always refer to it when we have these conversations, posits a fictional future where no one admits ever to have having eaten meat. It's been completely outlawed. Animals are free to live and die in much the same way that humans are, and it's a bit like the opposite of Woodstock. You know how if everyone who said they went to Woodstock had actually been to Woodstock, Woodstock would have been about 1 million times bigger than it actually was. So it is. It'd be like this with Brexit one day. Everybody, no one will give it another few years, and no one will admit to having voted for Brexit unless they were actually sort of foolish enough to boast about it on social media. Although you can always delete that, I suppose. But the fundamental philosophical point here is that even people that eat meat quite enthusiastically, probably know on some level that they shouldn't be doing so. And listen, I can do the dance about husbandry and well cared for meat, and if these animals weren't bred for food, they wouldn't exist at all. And I'm familiar with all of those arguments, and I make them in my own head. I've got vegetarians at home. I can't win these arguments. So, you know, we sort of live in a state of truce. But it's hypocrisy. And the reason why you then become so vicious and so unpleasant towards people who are doing what you secretly know to be right but can't admit is right because you want to carry on doing what is wrong is pathetic projection. I used to do this thing on air. You probably weren't listening because it was a while ago and no one was. I used to do this thing on air where I moaned about the fact that when Mrs. O'Brien and I got married, we had to provide a vegetarian option for our vegetarian guests. And, you know, it wasn't a fancy wedding. It was bang as a mash, but we had to provide vegetarian sausage. It was a lot harder back then. We'd been married for, good Lord, a very long time. And then I do this little bit on air about, well, I went to a vegetarian wedding on Saturday and they didn't provide a meat option for the meat eaters, so why did I? And I thought I was hilarious. You know, this is a bit like having kittens over a Greg's vegan sausage roll, which are actually delicious, by the way. The only reason they don't look as appetising as the meaty sausage rolls is because veganism also includes butter, so you can't put the glaze on the pastry, which makes the pastry look a little bit browner than the vegan sausage roll does, so although it looks a little bit pasty, now if I was still the old me at this point, I'd add a bit like a vegan, so it looks a little bit pasty, but if you bite into it, it's a little less crispy, but the innards are just as delicious as the meat version. But I still eat the meat version sometimes. More of a steak bake man these days, but occasionally I'll go for the sausage roll as well. So I know that I'm a hypocrite and I know that I'm a bit of a wally when it comes to this particular issue. And I think the horse racing question is the same, isn't it? Except that justifying it on the grounds of eating at least has a sort of biological rationale. But justifying it on the grounds of enjoying the spectacle and possibly placing a bet is, I mean, it is just pathetic. Isn't it? And that's what interests me, whether there is actually a more, what would you call it, a more sophisticated defence available than the either the sort of fingers in your ears and close your eyes and just go la 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 la. It's the Grand National. It's wonderful. It's magnificent. It's a crucial part of our heritage and our history. And it's all these I think the Mail went for vegan mob as a headline, and you just think, oh lads, take the day off. Vegan mob. It's a vegan mob. But how are you going to defend it if so many horses die? That's the question, really. Defend the deaths. 0345 6060 973 is the question. Defend the deaths. Because what you have to do, and this is probably going to be one of those phone-ins where I talk myself out of a switchboard, what you have to do is tell me why all these deaths are a price worth paying for the pleasure that you get out of watching horse racing. And no one ever really sets it up like that, do they? It's always, you read a newspaper column about it, it's, oh, why are they trying to stop our fun? Or, the horses... It sounded a bit like Ricky Gervais then, I didn't mean to. The horses, if it wasn't for horse racing, then the horses wouldn't actually exist because they've been born and bred for horse racing. You could make that argument about slavery. Could you imagine what would happen if we abolished slavery? You'd suddenly have all these people free, just sort of running around the place. All these horses, they'd be running up Brentford High Street. Be like a clip from Black Beauty. I don't know what the logistics are, but the logistics are not a defence of the principle. The principle is above logistics. I'll read some of these out. Yes, James, I remember your vegan veggie put-downs. I used to get very upset about it. Brandon says, James, can you explain cognitive dissonance to me as a thick brummie? You say it a lot. Well, from one thick brummie to another, Brandon, I can, actually. It's when you hold two contrary opinions in your head at the same time. So I eat meat, but I know that eating meat is wrong. I think that's the best way of explaining it. So it's like a fancy word for hypocrisy, really, a form of intellectual or philosophical hypocrisy. And there it is. That's it. So is anyone going to ring me and tell me? Obviously, you can ring me and tell me why you think all of this should be abolished or what have you. But tell me why. Pick your own numbers, really. Hill 16 was one of 3 horses who died during this year's 3-day Grand National Festival, down from 4 last year. But calls for tough action to repel the protesters had been demanded before the race. Do you know what Ian Duncan Smith said? He said, all these people ever do is protest. It's become a way of life for them. The police shouldn't tolerate it. There he is, saying the quiet bit out loud. The police should outlaw protest. Well done, Ian Duncan Donuts. Where would that leave the suffragists or the abolitionists back in the day? Or indeed any successful, or the anti-pop, well, he probably would want them. What are you going to do, lock them up for protesting about horses being killed for human pleasure? Because that's what it is. And logistics are here. Horse racing is a massive employer, James, says Rick in the New Forest. I'm going to alienate the horse racing community on this one. I don't particularly want to. My belief is that there are way too many horses in the Grand National. Well, what about the 2 races earlier in the meeting where a horse died, Rick? This would increase massive... So they should limit the amount of runners. It's become too greedy. Yeah, but like I said, there were 2 horses that died in previous races. And there are 36 horses have died at the festival since 2010. 49 horses have died at UK horse racing events this year alone. I think it's indefensible, right? And what would get... I mean, how about those Chinese festivals where they eat dogs? How do you feel about them? Yeah, exactly. Okay, now imagine that you were shown footage on Facebook of a Chinese festival where they just make dogs do things that leaves many of them dead. They don't even eat them. You see what I mean about cognitive dissonance? Oh no, it's awful, James, what they do with those dogs in China, but it's just food. Yeah, but they do terrible things. I mean, I find it obnoxious and repellent, by the way. Don't get me wrong. But how do you defend the horse racing? You can't, can you? Let's find out. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Just defend the deaths. Don't defend horse racing. Don't defend breeding. Don't tell me how many people are employed within the industry. Don't talk to me about the thrill of watching a horse gallop home against the odds and you've rinsed the bookies. I get all of that. I've been there. I've never been to a race meeting. I went to the point-to-point in Chaddesley Corbett on several occasions when I was a child, but it's not a major event in the horse racing calendar. It's great fun, though. I don't think any horses died. But that's what you've got to defend. You've got to say to me, yeah, James, of course, all right, 3 horses have died over the course of the 3-day meeting, but it's worth it because... That's what you've got to do. Anyone else who tries to have this conversation without telling you that is either part of the problem or patronising you. Look, I know the horses die, James. I know lots of horses die, but it's worth it because I get... ... 0345 6060 973. I know the horses die, James, but it's all worth it because I get... 0345 6060 973. Let's see how we get on. 11:49 is the time. Some rather splendid text coming in and lots of calls as well, so we'll get well stuck into this. A couple of texts first. Paige says, fox hunting used to be viewed as an important part of rural culture and tradition, but that's been mostly banned. The Grand National should go the way of fox hunting. But I also wonder that these are expensive animals. Why are they dying? Why aren't they being cared for? It's cost-benefit ratio. The money to be made if you get lucky, or if you get lucky. If you're lucky enough to own a horse that's a great performer, you're going to make a heck of a lot more money. So the risk of losing it all, and the horses will be insured as well, is part of the calculation. I presume this is a joke from Malky and Dumfries, but you can't always tell. He says, it's tragic what happened to those horses, James. But you never know what life has in store. They could have got run over by a bus tomorrow. Unlikely, I grant you, Malky, but hardly a rationale for the entire industry. And James says something that a few of you have picked up on, actually. I could be wrong, but it seems a bit daft to me. It's not Idiot's Corner daft, don't worry, but it just seems a little bit obvious. The flaw in it looks obvious to me. The deaths are unfortunate, and I do think more could be done to make it safer, to avoid horses getting injured to the point of being put down. But, it's a very big but, there are other sports where deaths occur. For example, motor racing. We get into a dangerous precedent where we'd call for a ban on every sport every time an unfortunate death occurs. Well, I mean, presumably that's a defence of those weird festivals that you see that we were talking about a moment ago in China. I mean, it's unnecessary suffering that we're objecting to, isn't it? No one forces Lewis Hamilton to get into a racing car, but horses don't have a great deal of choice in whether they get put into a horse race. Anyway, let's find out. Neil's in Clifford in West Yorkshire, horse racing country. Neil, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, mate.
I've worked in the horse racing industry pretty much all my life.
What has?
I've seen it. Photo finish operator. So I operate the camera.
Doesn't the camera do that?
Yes, but it has to be installed onto the race course and lined up.
I know it does. I just couldn't resist a cheap gag.
I know.
So hang on, phone Neil. Neil, which one came in first? Oh Christ, I blinked again. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, boss. Sorry, carry on.
That most people don't even think about until I say what I do.
No, of course. But it's quite interesting. A bit repetitive.
It is, yes, it is.
But deeply important.
Again, like most work.
Yeah, there are fortunes resting upon your work, though, aren't they? Which is rare. Go on.
Yeah. I think the elephant in the room is, I'm not going to... I love horse racing. I love horses.
Fair enough.
The elephant in the room is, and people daren't say this when they're defending horse racing because it sounds callous, but despite the fact that we love our horses, for the continuation of the sport, we are prepared for the odd horse now and again to suffer a fatal injury. That sounds callous, but unless people...
I respect your honesty. I mean, the next level of that the next sentence in that paragraph is, it is a price worth paying because we enjoy it so much.
Yes, I'm afraid it is, and that sounds really callous.
It does, because it is.
Yeah, yes. It is, yeah. But it's a high-octane sport where horses gallop at high speed, and horses are very badly made animals. They've got all that weight on 4 very thin, bony legs.
Yeah.
Their evolution.
Well, they're well made for other purposes, but they're just not necessarily well made for being hit with a stick to jump over fences while racing alongside other horses. I know they do. They receive injuries in the wild, but not on anything like the scale they do in a race meeting.
I will also add that the whip now has been very much sanitised. I remember the jockeys' whips in the old days. So they used to sting the horses, really sting the horses. The whips now are made of padded leather, and they have air inside. They're hollow inside. So it's more of a... It's more of a cracking
I get that. I mean, I don't know why I mentioned that, really. Yeah. It's not really part of it. But it's a smaller part of the conversation. But that is the bottom line, isn't it?
That is the bottom line. We have to say that we sanitise racing as much as we can, but we can never guarantee that a horse will not get injured and die. And I won't speak for the whole of the racing fraternity, but I am prepared for that risk to the horse.
Yeah, and you have to say that, and that's not cognitive dissonance, is it? But it is callous, as you say. It's also quite selfish in a way. I enjoy it so much. You're saying that the odd dead horse is an unfortunate but necessary side effect.
I'm afraid so. Yeah.
Wow. Well, I mean, you've kind of shot my fox, really, to mix my metaphors, because I didn't think anyone would be quite as bold as you are to actually say it quite as clearly. But I mean, you can't. The challenge now is to defend it without admitting, like Neil, that you are essentially callous. In this one area of your life. Okay, it's awful. I wish the horses didn't die, but I don't wish it enough to call for them to stop racing. 0345 6060 973. I'm going to set up a little competition, okay? So Philip Davis, who's a right old charmer and vice chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Racing and Bloodstock, is quoted in the Daily Mail today as saying, "I very much hope that the courts throw the book at these ignorant virtue-signalling anarchists who wouldn't know one end of a horse from another and whose antics did more damage to horse welfare on Saturday than anyone else." They didn't kill a horse, mate. But hey-ho, I suppose everybody's got different views on this matter. What the Daily Mail doesn't mention is the sort of donations or hospitality received by Tory MP Philip Davis in the course either of the last year or in the course of his parliamentary career. And I'm going to start doing this on the radio. I like this. So you can research that for me. Not the producer. She works far too hard as it is already. Someone find out for me the kind of kickbacks, that's not the right word to use, the kind of hospitality or donations that Philip Davis receives from the gambling industry before being quoted as some sort of apparently authoritative expert on the issue in newspapers like the Daily Mail. So, what prize can we offer? A special pat on the back from me would be the prize today. Text it to 84850. I may not see it if you tweet it because I'm in an unfamiliar studio today. And on my phone, Twitter is not as reliable as it used to be. I've got some breaking news for you. I don't know if you were listening to Mystery Hour on Thursday when Kyle revealed that his appendix scar can offer early indications of looming weather changes. Well, he's been in touch to say his scar has just started aching. So give it 1 or 2 days and there's going to be a dramatic change in the weather. I said to him on Thursday I wasn't sure this was scientific, but he's been in touch, and we shall have to wait and see now. So if the heavens open or the sun comes out in the next 24 to 48 hours, it's all because of Carl's appendix scar. Claire's in Dartford. Claire, what would you like to say?
Well, unfortunately, the chap before me did say quite a lot of what I was in agreement with, but the betting came after the racing.
Did it?
Oh, yeah.
I'm not sure about that, Claire.
The thoroughbred came about by four, and they can all be traced back to 4 Arab stallions. The Javali Turk, Godolphin, there was 4 of them, I can't remember all 4 of them.
Right.
And they were bred with the best of the British Army horses.
Yeah.
And
but even in the army, the soldiers would have a horse race and they'd put a few shillings on it, wouldn't they?
Yeah, but it wasn't mass. What I'm saying is it wasn't like massive, like the public. And you go back
there
to
were
the
only
days of
4
the old
horses.
steeplechases.
Yeah.
Where it used to be, well, obviously from steeple to steeple.
What is the point you're making?
Well, the point I'm making is it is the breeder is trying to breed the best athlete for the job. Those horses don't go down to that start unprepared.
No, but we would have a fairly heated conversation, wouldn't we, if we accepted that 2 or 3 sprinters were going to die in every Olympics?
They do get injuries, but unfortunately, with the way the horse is made, it's not always. It's seriously.
Well, no, I know they get injuries, but they've also consented to being in the race in a way that a horse can't.
But a horse is trained for that purpose.
Yeah. Well,
so a horse doesn't know any different, is what I'm saying.
Knows when it's broken its legs and gets,
Some horses can have their legs repaired. Yes.
So here is the thing. And this is what you knew was going to happen when you rang in. So I make no apologies for ambushing you with it. All right. I know a lot of horses die, but it's worth it because what, Claire? How do you finish that sentence?
I enjoy the spectacle of racing. I don't particularly enjoy the flat racing.
No.
Weirdly.
No, there was not as many deaths there.
I used to be a horse owner myself.
Yeah. But the spectacle, your enjoyment of the spectacle outweighs your unhappiness about dead horses.
To put it callously, yes.
Oh, no, just to put it clearly,
but
really.
Those horses are prepared.
Well, they're not.
To, as best as possible for that race.
Yeah.
It's like me just taking a donkey to the National and saying, right, come on, donkey, let's see how far you can go.
Yeah.
You just wouldn't do it, would you?
No. I don't know quite what point you think you're making with that observation, but no, I can definitely concur with you. I don't think you'd be allowed to. And the donkey wouldn't even try to leap the first fence, so the chances of it dying are probably 0, unless it gets landed on.
They do have to qualify for the race.
Yeah.
And over the years, the race has been... fences have been lowered, they've been made softer, even the poles around the track.
Yeah, but eventually they'll lower them so much it'll be flat and you won't enjoy it as much anymore.
Well, it's the skill.
I know all of this is true, but you can't get away from where we've just been. I say, look, I know the horses die, but it's worth it because I like watching it.
But three horses over the whole Grand National period is just like percentage-wise really minimal.
Yeah, that's great.
I know it sounds
36 since 2010, 36 at 2010 at that festival. 49 this year alone at horse racing events. Peanuts.
And is that the Cheltenham Festival as well?
It's all of them as far as I can tell.
And how many horses break down on the flat?
What do you think I am? Claire Balding? I don't know.
I'm just saying there are a lot of horses that do break down on the flat racing.
Yeah, I'm not defending that either, Claire. You're the one who said you don't like watching it as much, presumably because there's not quite as much peril involved. I don't know, but I salute both of my callers, Neil and Claire, who admit that they enjoy horse racing so much that they can, comfortably live with all the dead horses. I'm just pointing out that you probably haven't actually pushed or been pushed to that position previously. It's 1 minute after 12. It is... I should look at the clock really before I start that. 5 minutes after 12 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I'm just sifting through your entries or responses to my request for help in identifying the relationship that the Tory MP Philip Davis quoted in the Daily Mail as an expert on horse racing without any mention at all of some of the following facts. The only other MP to have, this is from January of 2023, the only other MP to have declared earnings from betting and gaming was Philip Davis, Conservative MP for Shipley, with £49,000 from GVC Holdings, now known as Entain, along with gifts and donations from Entain Holdings, the BGC, Flutter and GameSys. Davis, along with fellow Conservative Estimate Vate, to whom he's married, I think, I would add, received £4,550. She received £4,550 in gifts and benefits from the same company and £1,530 from GameSys. They faced criticism last year from Liberal Democrat opponents for their perceived closeness to the industry. But Philip Davis gets quoted in the Daily Mail today as chairman of the Vice Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Racing and Blust Stock, speaking ignorantly and unpleasantly about the protesters at Aintree on Saturday without any mention at all of what he has received from companies linked to gambling. That's the first entry as well. That's the only one I've looked at the link on, but I bet there are others as well. Let's have another look, shall we? Here you go. 2020, 96% of... So more than 3 years after the government announced its review of the Gambling Act in 2005, the white paper is reportedly finally due for release, reported Private Eye earlier this year. In 2018 and 19, the industry gave MPs a total of £12,549 and £20,034 respectively. In 2020, after the review announcement, this rose to a whopping £128,990. It went up again in 2021. This is money from the gambling industry essentially being donated to politicians. In 2020, 96% of the money donated went to employ MPs as advisors. Philip Davis, Tory MP for Shipley, the one that's quoted in the Daily Mail today as an authoritative voice on the protest at Aintree on Saturday, but somehow the people that wrote the story edited it, put it in the newspaper, haven't mentioned any of this. I can't imagine why. He received almost £50,000 for advising the company which owns Ladbrokes, Coral and Party Poker. That was the one formerly GVC Holdings, now known as Entain. Anyway, this is what he had to say about it. I very much hope that the court throws the book at these ignorant virtue-signalling anarchists who wouldn't know one end of a horse from another. How much again was it, Phil? Just under 50 grand in 2020 for advising them. Yeah. Nice work if you can get it. Vicky's in Chelsea. Vicky, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello, Vicky.
I love you and I love your programme. I listen every day. I agree with pretty much everything you say.
I bet you didn't when you started listening.
Well,
you're very kind. You're very kind. Let's not spoil it.
Let's put it this way. One or two of the callers that I strongly disagree with. Let's put it that way.
Fair enough. All human life is here.
And I'm not a virtue signalling anarchist that doesn't know one end of a horse from another.
Well, you would say that.
Well, I would say that because I mean it, James.
I bet you know one end of a 50 grand cheque from the other, don't you?
Yeah, but I wouldn't.
So does Philip Davis.
Yeah, well.
Anyway, why did you ring in?
We won't go there. That's a long story, isn't it? Yes. I agree entirely with you that it is not worth even one horse's death to win something with gambling.
Well, I don't know. I mean, you're going a bit further than I am, actually, because I'm interested really in pushing people like Neil and Claire to the point where they have to admit their slightly grim outlook, but they were both honest enough to admit it. I don't know that I would call... I have to call for it to be abolished, otherwise I sit here and say something I don't even watch. I agree with you. I would call for it to be abolished completely because it's animal abuse, James, pure and simple. How about the argument that if it wasn't for the horse racing, the horses wouldn't actually exist?
That's rubbish.
Well, it's not. It might not be a very powerful argument, but I heard someone making it earlier today, and I mean there is a sort of logic to it, isn't there?
No.
But what? There is, though, because I mean, they're breeding. So what, you get a stallion and you get a mare and you introduce them to each other, buy them dinner, bunch of flowers, and you hope that they will breed because they're going to produce a racing horse that's really impressive,
Okay, how about flat racing? Flat racing, horses to stand less of a chance of dying on flat racing.
Yeah.
But I don't approve of that either.
Well, they'd come for that next. That's what the racing lobby would say, isn't it? We've lowered the fences. How low do you want? We're going to dig ditches next. They're going to be jumping over Oh, they do that already, don't they?
Well, 3 horses died over the event. It was. No, I'm sorry. There is no excuse for using an animal who doesn't have a choice for the benefit of humans. That's my argument.
Well, I mean, it is doing things that will cause horses to die for the amusement of humans.
Exactly.
What's the difference between horse racing and bullfighting?
Well, that should be banned as well. But
well,
we
I
don't
know,
have that.
but I think it has in this country. But I'm saying most horse racing fans probably don't think that they're like bullfighting fans, do they? But they kind of are. The bull has a fighting chance.
Are.
The bull has a fighting chance.
They absolutely are, James.
I know.
Yes.
Yeah. YouTube's full of bulls getting the better of a matador or a toreador.
Well, basically, my argument would be one of my grandfathers was a vet, and I think I come from that angle. He taught me to be kind to animals since I was a little girl, and I've stuck with that. I'm also a pagan, which means I respect nature in all its forms.
See, I respect you, and I wouldn't have done 10 years ago, for which I can only apologise. Or I probably would have known that I should, but I would have been a bit disrespectful or irreverent at this point.
And I'm not a horsey person,
No.
as your researcher said. I've never had anything to do with horses. However,
it's life.
The parallel that was drawn by one of your callers between horse racing and motor racing, it falls down because we have a choice
at the first hurdle.
We have exactly. We have a choice. The animals
No, I know
don't.
that. I think that's fairly obvious, but sometimes people, I find personally, sometimes I don't see the flaws in my own position until I air them publicly or let them reach oxygen. But I can't imagine anyone would sustain the argument that it's just like horse racing for very long, although Claire did point out that Olympians get injured. Apparently under the impression that was somehow pertinent to the point that horses get killed. Back to Philip Davis. Carl, you're doing a great job for me. A Tory MP lobbied cabinet ministers on behalf of the horse racing industry, having previously received free tickets to race days with a value of £25,000 from racing and gambling firms. Documents show. I'm just going to go back to that Daily Mail article. Surely they've mentioned some of this. Wait there, here it is. Tory MP Philip Davis, Vice Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Racing and Bloodstock, said, "I very much hope that the courts throw the book at these ignorant virtue-signalling anarchists who wouldn't know one end of a horse from another and whose antics did more damage to horse welfare on Saturday than anyone else." Nowhere does it mention that Philip Davis, the MP for Shipley, lobbied Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, and Oliver Dowden when he was Culture Secretary by forwarding correspondence from racing organisations advocating policy changes that would directly benefit the industries in 2020. The documents, obtained by The Times under Freedom of Information laws, details Davis's previously unknown lobbying efforts. The gambling and racing industries are closely linked. No kidding, Sherlock. With betting on the races among the highest source of income for betting firms. And there it is. A report from the Times newspaper dated July the 1st, 2022. Speaking of dates, I wouldn't be surprised if the Gambling Act Review white paper appeared before the end of this month. Just a little... my appendix scar has started... I don't have an appendix scar. It's an in-joke. You had to be there. It's 12:15. Davies vociferously denied that he was conflicted by the hospitality he had received, telling The Times, "If you can find any evidence that I have changed my stance on something as a result of any hospitality, then good luck to you." Well, how much hospitality? In total, Davis has received 107 free tickets to racing festivals from betting, racing and associated media companies worth at least £32,000 since he entered Parliament in 2005. He received 25 grand's worth before he sent lobbying letters to ministers, as well as the tickets to race days. He received tickets from gambling firms to sporting events such as Wimbledon, worth £6,500. I don't think, I mean, there's no suggestion that he has broken lobbying rules in the way that Owen Paterson did before Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg tried to rescue his career. But that might actually be a case for reviewing the system. Certainly the Daily Mail should probably have mentioned some of this when offering up Philip Davies MP this morning as a rather hysterical critic of the protesters at Aintree on Saturday. Jack's in Twickenham, more of a rugby locale than a horse racing locale, but I'm sure he's mobile. Jack, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome.
And I work in the horse racing industry. I've written about horse racing for a well-known newspaper for quite a few years now.
Excellent.
So I am first and foremost, I'm an animal lover, and I would not work in the racing industry or love the sport if I felt that it was cruel in any way, shape, or form to the horses. Obviously, my position is.
I mean, they do die though.
They absolutely do, and this is part of the
just
process.
Say that. Just say,
I
know they die, but I wouldn't work in the industry if it was in any way cruel.
Yes, and it's not cruel.
Do you not? Can you hear even the vaguest suspicion of problem in that sentence?
Well, you could go to a farm or any other environment in the country, any rural part of the country where there are animals or working animals, and unfortunately, animals will have accidents or they will suffer injuries.
You tend not to have
die.
Enormous grandstands full of people screaming hysterically with joy at the sight of, I don't know, a cow eating grass in a field, Jack, or a sheepdog, rounding up. Actually, I quite like that as a spectator sport. I'm pretty sure that doesn't involve several deaths a year of sheep or dogs. So I don't know quite why you're bringing farms into it. The thing you love watching kills horses, and that is a price worth paying because you love watching it so much.
And this is the thing, if you are a fan of horse racing, you almost sign a moral contract. You know that these horses are, whenever they go to the races, they potentially could suffer an injury. But I mean, forgive me, I don't have the statistics to hand, but I know the fatality rate per year on British racecourses is I think it's lower than 0.2%, something around that.
I'm happy to accept that, but that's the point, isn't it? It could be zero. No horses would get killed in horse racing if there wasn't any horse racing.
It could be zero. And
so as an animal lover, you're choosing between some deaths or no deaths. And as an animal lover, you're saying some deaths. Which seems odd, doesn't it? Because a lot of animal lovers listening would probably go for no deaths.
But you'd also have to say, and obviously you referred to it earlier on the show, that life, if these horses wouldn't have a life if it wasn't for racing, they wouldn't, it's whether life is the preference is life as a race.
Yeah, but you'd have to be able to, you'd have to ask the horse for that to be an even vaguely pertinent contribution to the conversation, wouldn't you? You'd have to say to the horse. So you can say that to a racing driver. You can say, look, you're getting 50 million quid per race or whatever it is, but there is a chance, a very real chance, you could die or get seriously injured. Are you sure you want to do this? And the racing driver can say yes. The horse, you could say, look, you're going to get a nice stable and a new blanket, but there's a very real chance you're going to die. Do you fancy it? If horses could talk, they'd probably say, jog on, mate. You run the race. Well, I'll watch. Let's send Jack jumping over enormous fences with 50 other people in danger of tripping him up and landing on him.
I mean, there is a legitimate debate to be had here. I mean, I do think there is a real misunderstanding between groups like Animal Rising and the horse racing industry. Obviously, they're poles apart on where they stand on this.
Well, I think we can agree on, Jack.
But there's a lot of, I don't feel some of the inflammatory language being banned around is very helpful. Like we said, there is.
Well, nor do I. You mean language like this? I very much hope that these courts throw the book at these ignorant virtue signalling anarchists who wouldn't know one end of a horse from another and whose antics did more damage to horse welfare on Saturday than anyone else. Or language like this: all these people ever do is protest. It's become a way of life for them. The police shouldn't tolerate it. Is that what you mean by inflammatory language?
No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't endorse any of that, and I feel like those comments aren't helpful to the conversation. But on the other side of the argument, I heard a caller earlier, an Animal Rising member earlier, who said in the racing industry, we like to race horses to exhaustion and then we shoot them. I mean, that's not particularly helpful. And yourself earlier saying how is horse racing different to bullfighting?
Yeah, go on.
That bull is going in a bull ring into a arena, and it's going in there to be killed. Yeah. We don't send race horses to the track.
Well, no. Bulls can win.
Well, of course they can win, but nobody. The whole point
like
of that
horses.
sport is to
like
try
horses.
and kill. Yeah, but the point of bullfighting is to kill the bull. The point of horse racing isn't to kill the horse.
No,
you know?
it's just an unpleasant side effect. But death is death. And sport causes death in both cases. And spectators love it. And there's loads of people at bullfights who think they're animal lovers as well, mate.
But people who go horse racing don't love to see a horse get injured or killed. And for example, I mean...
but they don't hate it enough, Jack, do they? In fact, let's not say they. Let's say you. You don't hate it enough.
Trust me, I've been
in the way that the people you're criticising do. So we look at the people protesting. They find the idea of a dead horse so utterly unbearable that they're prepared to risk their own safety to stop horse racing. You don't hate it enough, Jack.
I absolutely understand that there is a risk in the sport. When these horses go to the track, of course there is a risk. Nobody wants to see a horse get injured, and for my job,
but you don't want to see it enough to want it to stop. That's the point. I'm not even criticising you, and I've got the first two calls in my pocket who said, "I know it's callous," and you're fighting shy of that. I'm afraid.
No,
obvious conclusions. So you can say you're an animal lover, but you don't love animals enough to object to a sport that kills them.
And I would agree with those callers. Of course, we know that horses die, and this is absolutely. But this is the thing. I've been to a racing stable this morning where I spoke with a trainer who had a horse who was very successful for a number of years. He absolutely adored him. He retired him when he got a bit long in the tooth, and he was going to live out his days at the yard. And within 2 or 3 days of him being out in the field, they went out in the morning. And they found that he's broken his leg. So horses break their legs in the field. These are very flighty, unpredictable animals who are cared for unbelievably well. Nobody ever wants to see harm come to these animals. They're beautiful animals.
But we're going round in circles again. I don't want to see harm come to these animals, or the protesters yesterday are so allied to the view that they don't want to see harm to these animals that they're keen to stop processes and practices that have a proven likelihood of causing harm to these animals, whereas you're not. So, it's not a condemnation or a criticism. It's just a statement of fact. And the sentence for you would end how? So it's say, look, I know horses die and it's awful, but it's a price worth paying because I love the sport and I love the animals and I love, these horses. You can't say their death is a price worth paying because I love them, Jack. That's just silly.
No, their death is obviously, it's a very
their death is a price worth paying because I, Jack...
Yeah, I absolutely adore the sport.
There we go.
Absolutely.
That's fine.
And I agree.
Enough to accommodate their deaths.
Unfortunately,
so it's like the Hunger Games, but with horses. It's like you're in Parnem. You might not be familiar with the Hunger Games, but no one wants to see the people die. But hey ho, that's the price. Well, actually, that's not going to work because people do want to see the people die.
No, but this is the thing. Nobody in horse racing has that sort of blasé attitude towards it. And there have been so many advances in welfare. I mean, we take it incredibly seriously as an industry.
All right.
But yes, you're right. This is, as I say, when you become a fan
it's indefensible. Listen, it's really sort of when you say things like I'm an animal lover that my little heckles start rising. It's not subject. I mean, proper animal lovers are going to hate me for saying this, but it's not something that keeps me awake at night. But I don't like the idea of the people who it is keeping awake at night because they do, like earlier callers, feel the pain of an animal's pain, ending up somehow being on the receiving end of a kicking from the usual suspects from people who are less honest than you, Jack, let's put it that way, who say, they deny that. I mean, Philip Davis claiming that the protesters have done more harm to horse welfare than horse racing is beyond ridiculous. But, you've got to keep those tickets coming in, haven't you, Phil? Thank you, Jack. And I respect your attempts to argue your position. But, of course, to argue the opposite position would put you in the role of a turkey voting for Christmas. And I completely understand why you wouldn't want to do that. Mark's in Redhill. Mark, what do you reckon?
Well, you know what, James? We spoke last week, actually. And I was looking
whoa. How do you get on again? It's not one of those shows where we speak to the same people on a regular basis. Why do you think I give out the phone number? I don't want to end up talking to the same 6 people every morning.
Oh, dear me. Well, I'm in Prague right now for work.
Oh, well, that's how you got. That's how you've nipped through the net. You see, by moving around like a moving target. What do you want to say?
You can call me Sneaky Sod.
Go on.
I'm still laughing.
Carry on,
James. I'm really conflicted with this because I love horse racing. And I really do. And you know what? The Windsor Monday night in summer watching the flat races for me was one of my delights in life.
Yes.
But
it must be thrilling. I do understand that. I can see how it's really thrilling.
Yeah, it is, and it's a wonderful spectacle. But you know what? The loss of one horse is too much. It really is too much. And the Grand National is one of these absurdities that we seem to approve of. A country of animal lovers, and you have these horses. I'm originally a Liverpudlian, so I've been to the Grand National, and it's absurd. Why on earth would you subject these poor animals to this?
But the same thrill, isn't it, of watching the kind of horse racing that you enjoy?
Well, you know what?
There's just bigger challenges before the horses.
Yeah,
so
I'm quite prepared to lose. Do you know what? If it would save a horse's life, I'm quite happy not to go to the races. It's a bit like boxing. I hate boxing. You know, we punch each other.
Boxing is a tough one for me. I actually quite like boxing. Would you?
Yeah, well, so do I.
But it's consent from humans. I don't like seeing people get hurt, but you're watching it in the knowledge that one of them is going to get hurt. So now I possibly sound like a horse racing fan, but at least the boxers, have full consent.
It's the same thing. We do it by consent. We watch these poor animals run around a circuit over, I don't know, a couple of miles or whatever it may be, to jump over incredibly high hurdles. But, you know what, I make the comparison to boxing. You know what, we're quite happy to consent to that, to watch two men or two women beat the
living daylights out of each other, yes.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Well, I mean, I can see some parallels with it and you know, the arguments about opportunity, but you can't get away from consent. I'm pretty sure that if horses could talk, if Mr. Ed was not a figment of a scriptwriter's imagination, and because you say to a boxer, do you want to get in that, you could risk brain damage or worse in that ring, but if you win, untold riches and fame beyond your wildest dreams. It's a trade-off. You say to a horse, do you want to get in that race? Run a risk of serious injury or death, and in return, I don't know, you can have some extra oats and a new blanket. Well, I don't know, we'll put some essential eating in your stable. Or so, the horse is just going to go, get lost. It's going to go, nay. I've waited an hour to do that joke. It's going to go, nay, you run the race. Let's get the humans to do it. But with genuine risk and peril. And of course, the point is that however much you love your horses as you train them, you get the money when they win. And that somehow softens the moral dilemma of knowing that they could suffer serious injury or even death in pursuit of epic prizes for you. I think it's that serious. It is a bit Lord Farquhar, a few of you are saying. Some of you may die, but that is a risk that I am willing to take. It's the equine equivalent of that. It's coming up to 12:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. I don't know whether this will work just as a sound file, but the guy sounded like I knew what I was talking about then. Is it? It's not even a sound file, is it? No. Anyway, I don't know if this will work without pictures because this is everyone's worst nightmare. But it's doubly funny in Rishi Sunak's case because in order to avoid answering questions from the media, even though this government only invites friendly media. If you got invited to go to Rwanda with Suella Braverman, I mean, the shame of that. Imagine knowing that you were on the list of people who weren't going to ask embarrassing or even vaguely difficult questions of a government that was planning something as hideous as that particular policy. And if you're thinking to yourself now, oh, that's not hideous at all, well, I've got some bad news for you. I'm trying to use my phone then to find something while the clip was playing in the background. I'm such a pro. Let's play the clip in the foreground, please. This is Rishi Sunak learning 2 lessons. Number 1, what it feels like as a stand-up comedian to die on stage in front of an audience. And number 2, why whoever had the genius idea of inviting questions from the audience at a public appearance in order to minimise the amount of time spent answering questions from journalists may not have deserved that bonus that you gave them last month.
Right, who's next? Anyone else? All good? No others from you? Anyone else have some questions before we get over to the media? Okay, gosh, it's very quiet. Anyway, actually, I'll broaden up. Do you have any questions on things that are not related to maths? I'm also fine for those. All fine? Right, okay, well, we'll turn to the media for some questions.
Students, bloody students at my school. I don't think that was that a school or a college? Do we know? At my school, I used to get It's the only time they were ever nice to me. The teachers would always make sure I had a couple of you can imagine me. Well, hands straight up in the air. Oh, yes, me. But the teachers, even the teachers that would cross the road to avoid me the rest of the time, if we were having a luminary coming to address the sixth form or address the school, they'd always make sure that one or two of us were primed with questions in order to avoid precisely that situation. If there were students, because now I'm older and wiser, if there were students who'd been primed in advance to avoid Rishi Sunak's embarrassment by asking questions and then they kept their hands down, I'd like to buy them a Vimto, if I may, because I think that is a very funny little moment. Speaking of Rwanda, which I was a minute ago, the government has not only locked up opposition leaders, it also claims to have won 99% of the vote at the last presidential election. Rishi Sunak's spokesman has just been put in the position of describing Rwanda as clearly a democratic country that is safe and secure, which presumably would now also apply to North Korea, where they also get, I think maybe if you get 100% in an election, then the Conservative Party might question whether or not you are a democratic country that's safe and secure. But if you get 99%, then it's a perfectly reasonable result in a perfectly democratic election in a perfectly safe country where the government locks up opposition leaders. The opposition have somehow, nonetheless, managed to get a story out into the British media today. And the story is this: Rwanda does not have the space to house thousands of refugees from the UK. And they will face persecution from the state if they protest against conditions, one of Rwanda's main opposition leaders has warned. But why would you listen to him? He only got 1% in the last election, didn't he? Victoire Ingabire Umuhoza said that migrants relocated from Britain under the controversial deportation deal would struggle to find work. She said importing thousands of working-age men into the country would be unfair on the domestic population, given the unemployment rate, which is about 16%, according to the Rwandan government's statistics. So that's going well. It's possible it's never intended to be an actual policy and is intended instead to appeal to the racist tendencies of the Conservative Party members who will be responsible for choosing the next Conservative Party leader, which may explain absolutely everything that Suella Braverman is currently doing, up to and including the racist rhetoric, not my words, the words of Saida Varsi, the first South Asian person, I think, to sit in a British cabinet. As a Conservative, co-chairman of the Conservative Party, up to and including the racist rhetoric that she deploys in the context of these sort of conversations. Let's take it back to the horses, and then I want to catch up with the situation in Scotland, which is getting curiouser and curiouser, as Alice said. Mac's in Wembley. Mac, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I'd like to say on the horse matter is, first of all, I heard a gentleman say he adores the sport.
Yeah.
I would want people to adore the horses. Then we might get a deeper understanding.
That's a good point.
Also, for me, the horse racing, what I hate is that the horses are being whipped. Now, I've watched documentaries, I've researched the whips, and they said that the whip doesn't hurt the horse. But the horse runs faster because it's being whipped.
Yeah.
Now, it is being struck. Now, it won't break the horse's back, but I do believe it breaks the horse's spirit. No horse knows what the Grand National means to us or to them. They're just running. And if I'm whipped, I run faster. Now, all I'm saying is that if athletes, Usain Bolt and all the athletes, were put electric probes in their neck to see if they could do more than the record that they've got currently, then would they give athletes little electric shocks?
I hear what you're saying, and you know, performance enhancing drugs. People, they'll do anything to speed up animals, horses, because there's money on the table. There's bets to be landed and to be won. But I don't know about the whip. Actually, it looks like it hurts. It probably hurt you and me, but I mean, it might just be a gentle reminder to the horse that it's got a little bit left in the tank, Mac.
So my dog is huge.
Yeah?
He can run.
Hang on a minute. I just love the idea of someone who's just turned on the radio. Like, they didn't hear any of the bit that went before. They've just turned on the radio and they've heard Mac in Wembley say, listen, my dog is huge. Tell me more, Mac. Tell me more about your enormous dog.
No, I'm saying that these people, I know big guys, you hit them in a ring like, say, that peanut butter boxer. He still got hurt no matter his size.
Yeah.
Okay? So
Lost
the
me a
whip
bit.
is hurting, which is why it's making the horse perform more.
Yes.
So all I would want to say, if people don't agree, Why can't we just have the horses run to their ability without the whip, and then that becomes the fastest horse?
Yeah, you've changed the subject a bit, because they'd still die if they were jumping over the fences and stuff like that, wouldn't they?
Yeah, but that there, what we're talking about.
What's the massive dog called? Wasn't Jack Whitehall in the film?
No.
What's it called? There's a film about an enormous dog with Jack Whitehall in it.
I'm not sure.
No, nor am I. Sorry.
Marmaduke.
What? It's not
Marmaduke.
It's not Marmaduke. Where are you getting Marmaduke from?
I don't know. Great.
What?
What's it?
I don't know. So that massive.
Beethoven.
He does an American accent in it. I'm trying to get him on full disclosure at the moment, so I'm just giving him some
K9.
love. It's not K9. That's from about 1983. Clifford.
Clifford the dog.
How big is Clifford?
All I'm saying,
The
guys,
big
is
red
that
dog. It's called the big red dog.
It's not good for the horses. Any horse that died.
No.
The horse is being whipped. I just say that, guys. I know you love the sport.
Well, they
but
say they
things
love the
change.
sport. Don't try loving the
things
horses.
change. Look after the horses. The horses
I'm
don't
with
care
you.
about.
I'm with you. It's been an interesting conversation because no one really is trying to pretend that they are. I mean, Jack had a go, fair play, but he's a horse racing journalist. You can't expect him to be queuing up to criticise his livelihood. But the bottom line is, all right, I know some horses will die, but that is a price I'm prepared to pay for my huge enjoyment of the pleasure of it. And Mac's right, the whipping as well. It's a bit off topic, but it's pertinent to the bigger question. Sam asks, and we've kind of covered this, Sam, but you might have just tuned in, hopefully in time to hear Mac describe the size of his dog. How big is your dog, Mac? Up to your waist?
About 9 inches. No, he's 9 inches up to my waist, 9 inches from my waist.
Little fella then. Thank you, Mac. It is 12:42. And question from Sam, what do we do with all the racing horses if we stop horse racing? Because they'll all need to be put down because of costs to keep them and what they would do as they are bred to race. Well, that is not the issue, is it? Because if you don't stop horse racing, they're going to carry on breeding horses again and again and again and again for multiple generations into the future. Carol is in Billericay. Carol, what would you like to say?
Hi, thank you. I don't think I can follow the dog story, though.
No. Well, don't try. Whatever you do, don't try. Where were we?
I was in, the late 70s. I was one of the first female betting shop managers, and the Grand National was dead. The Grand National is a race apart from all the other races.
Yes,
calendars.
it is. It's the only horse race that most people know about, isn't it, really?
Yeah, it is. People bet on it because of the names, of the pretty
What do you mean it was
colours.
dead? Why did you say it was dead?
It just, there was no interest in it.
Really?
At all.
Really?
Yeah. And then Bob Champion
Yes.
and Aldeniti won it.
I remember that.
Yeah.
Right, I remember the film, actually, with John Hurt in it.
Yeah. And it brought the interest back.
Is that right?
And the thing is, in the betting industry, no proper gamblers at that time would even touch the Grand National because it is a lucky race. It's just for luck that they win it.
But it can't be that because the favourite often wins, so it can't be pure luck.
It's not. It is mainly luck because of the way the course is set out. The fences. It's a dangerous race because the fences are so high, and the way the course is set out.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough.
Right. So we've brought the fences down. But it is a race apart. It is a dangerous race, and that is why it is in the national psyche, I think.
Yeah, probably. I mean, people are less reluctant to it. Why do you enjoy the National Hunt so much? Well, because there's a chance. I mean, not even it's a price worth paying, but it's the actual reason why I like it so much, because there's a risk of danger.
There's a danger there, but it is a housewife's race. You know, you used to get it. I think it's so much now, but you used to have queues when you open the door on Grand National Day of all the housewives with all their families' little bets, and it was nothing to do with form.
No, it was just
like
fun. You'd cut it out of the newspaper, wouldn't you? You could do a sweepstake.
The betting shop industry loved it because you used to be able to get people who never bet into the betting shop.
But if they got rid of horse racing, you'd have been out of a job.
I never watched a horse race.
You might not have watched one, but you wouldn't have had much to do at work if there wasn't any.
Well, I don't know. I mean...
I do.
Well, you've got the... If you're a gambler, when I was there, we never had any fruit machines or anything like that.
If you're a gambler, you'll find something to gamble on.
Yes.
You'll gamble on 2 raindrops making their way down a window.
I've had people in my shop betting on 2 flies.
There you go.
But that is what it is. The Grand National is a race apart.
Would you get rid of it?
Yes.
Yeah, you see? Because you love horses. Well.
Yeah. And there's no reason for it to be so dangerous.
I mean, that is the thing, though, because that's where, if I were being paid the sort of money that Philip Davies, for example, gets from the gambling industry, I would conjure up an argument about where is the line, though? Because at some point, surely you're going to have to recognise there's a danger inherent in any contest. Footballers can suffer terribly. All right, you get consent with that, but we've done everything we can. Flat racing, whatever it may be. Do you just get rid of it completely? Everything that involves animals being used for human pleasure, whether it is eating or racing snails? I don't know. But that would be where I'd go. Argumentatively. Red Rum, we missed out Red Rum a bit, did we? Red Rum was after Old Aniti. So the amazing thing about that was that Bob Champion had recovered from cancer, and I think Old Aniti had recovered from serious injury as well, and they went on to win the Grand National. It's a really, really good film, actually. Starring John Hurt, who's never been in a bad film. Don't at me with a bad film that John Hurt's been in. I love a brilliant actor. This is some breaking news. It's got nothing to do with Carl's appendix scar. Rishi Sunak has been, the Parliament Standards Watchdog has opened an investigation into Rishi Sunak over a possible failure to declare an interest. More on that when we have more detail. These investigations, I think, end up concluding there is nothing wrong more often than they conclude that there is something wrong. But when it happens to a Prime Minister, I think it's worthy at least of mention. And when it happens to a former First Minister in Scotland, I think that is worthy of mention as well. So we'll catch up with the situation surrounding Nicola Sturgeon and her husband and the SNP in general with Alexander Brown of the Scotsman after this. It's 10 to 1. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. The little deliberate mistake that I throw into the show occasionally, just in case anyone gets irritated by me being right about everything. Red Rum was long before Old Aniti. 73, 74 and 77, I think, off the top of my head. And Old Aniti was in 81. But I was right, though. I knew that Bob Champion had recovered from cancer before riding Old Aniti to victory in the Grand National. But Old Aniti had a career-threatening injury as well. I saw the film when I was I must have been about 12. So they got that out quite quickly. I was just challenging the point about saying Old Aniti was what generated public excitement in the Grand National. That can't be true, can it, from our last caller? Because Red Rum was the most famous horse in history, probably, with the possible exception of Shergar, in 73, 74 and 77. And, Old Aniti played himself in the film of the... there you go. You live and learn. We need to learn a little about Scottish politics, I think, and we will do so imminently. I might just squeeze in Maria in Milton Keynes while we wait for Alexander Brown of the Scotsman newspaper to join us on air. Maria, last word probably on the horses, so make it a good one.
Oh, I'll do my best.
There you go.
Don't set me up for a fool, please,
well
James. I know horses. I've kept horses. You have one of your earlier callers was saying that they came from the Arabian stock. So,
yes.
Thoroughbreds, which are what are used for racing horses, yes. They are called hot bloods, and
right.
Your dressage horses are warm bloods, and your draft, like the big heavy horses, are called cold bloods.
Didn't know that.
So dressage are a combination of the size from the cold bloods and I don't know if it would be intelligence, but from the hot bloods, so they're a warm.
Okay.
But with horse racing, they race them as babies, as 2 and 3 year olds. Whereas if you were breaking a horse to be a riding horse, you wouldn't start to break them until they were like 4 years old.
Okay.
And you get so many horses once they're cast aside because they're either no good, they're not good enough, they're not fast enough, they don't want to do it, etc., etc. They will then go out into the ridden population.
Yes, I understand.
So to speak, yes. But then you get so many problems with them, sort of like they are very highly strung because of how they've been
pushed from such an early age. I understand that.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's just to say, I love the horse. They're just a commodity. There'll be another one to take its place. That one can drop down dead. That's okay. We'll stick in the next one. That one can drop down dead.
So the idea. So just briefly, because I've got Alexander Brown of the Scotsman waiting to talk to me. How do you respond to the claim from some of the callers today that they are the animal lovers, even though they also love the Grand National?
They only love the Grand National.
They don't love the. You can't love the animals.
Love the animals. You can't. You absolutely can't. So
that is a pride. Well, I mean, the trainers must. If are you training a horse and the horse dies, you're going to cry.
I don't know about crying.
I think they would.
Like saying, but what about that? Would be the same as saying a doctor would cry when they lose a patient. You become numb to it.
I don't know that analogy works.
I
like the way you delivered it with full confidence.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
I think that I'm not saying that they wouldn't care.
Yeah. But they don't care enough to stop it from doing something that makes them a ton of money and runs a very real risk of the horse being shot in the head. Thank you, Maria. Lovely stuff. I've always been slightly a combination of awed and intimidated by horses, but I'm conscious of people just turning on their radio and hearing me sound as though I am channeling Alan Partridge. Let's go to Alexander Brown, Westminster correspondent of The Scotsman, but I suspect he is keeping a very close eye on events back home as well. And these events are becoming curiouser and curiouser by the day, Alex. Could you just bring us up to speed with what's happened over the weekend?
So, over the weekend, we learnt that the former First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, had previously told the SNP's NEC the party had never been in a stronger financial position than it is in now. She said that she refused to get into details, but any suggestions as issues with the party's finances are just wrong. I think that was days before a complaint was made to police about the use of some missing money, £600,000 of donations earmarked for the independence referendum campaign. And it's all pretty uncomfortable. And I think also, it was just a year after that the party's auditors quit. Not that was something that they ever told senior party figures or the public.
I mean, you've just given us a nice little thumbnail sketch, but there's an awful lot to possibly the auditors quit. If you had to pick the most significant, potentially significant element, because it's still possible that all of this will turn out to be a storm in a teacup and there are no questions to be answered, or they've all been satisfactorily answered. If you, as a journalist, which bit of this unfolding saga made your ears prick up the most?
Well, the camper van. I don't know if you're familiar.
Tell us about the camper
van. Which again sounds like the Alan Partridge thing, but the party had a £110,000 camper van, which we were told recently was bought as a battle bus, but it was never used as a battle bus. And in fact, it's just a luxury camper van that was at Peter Murrell, the former SNP chief executive and the husband of Miss Sturgeon. It was just at his mum's house. So there was a £110,000 camper van bought for by the party just at his mum's house that was never used. That is the strangest and funniest element of this. And it hasn't really been explained why. So, that seems like the
and
thing.
And it is kitted out as a camper van. It's not kitted out as
there's no painting on it. There's no,
350 million quid for I don't know, Scottish independence plastered on the side of it or anything like that. It is just a camper van, and it was parked outside her mother-in-law's house.
Yeah, and there doesn't seem to be any explanation given to that. And obviously the auditors going in isolation, talking about auditing, incredibly boring. But the fact the party didn't talk about it or tell anyone their auditors had quit, which meant when the news broke, we all said, oh, well, mate, is this in response to the arrests and the spades and the ground at the former First Minister's house? And then we found out it happened last year. The new SNP Westminster leader, Stephen Flynn, he said he didn't know about this. It was news to him. But then Ian Blackford said that he knew late last year. So either everyone is incredibly bad at communicating, or this is all incredibly unfortunate for the SNP, because how could they have known?
And any indication yet? I mean, I know that the media is having a party, as it were, huge numbers of front pages and interest. Any indication yet of what it might be doing for the sort of broader reputation of the SNP, broader support for the SNP in general, and of course for the new leader, Humza Yousaf in particular? It's a nightmare for him, isn't it, to be inheriting this sort of scenario?
Yeah, I feel quite naive, because I thought when the leadership contest ended that it would be a bit quieter after that, which speaks to my merits as a journalist. But no, the polling shows that Scottish Labour have been making up huge ground on the SNP, and it was always going to be difficult for Humza Yousaf, the new First Minister, because he is not as good a communicator or as popular within his own party or among the wider Scottish public as Nicola Sturgeon was. There is a nickname of Hapless Humza, which does not come from rival parties. It comes from inside his own. So already things would be So already things would be difficult. And the conversation was how he had, the most challenging in tray of any incoming First Minister. And now this has happened.
And now it's getting more challenging by the day. Alexander, thank you. Moving on only because I have run out of time, except to remind everybody that you can listen to today's show in its entirety, but without some of the junctions and with the benefit of fast forward and rewind and pause by downloading Global Player and catching up on the show there. You can also, of course, find all the podcasts under the sun, or almost all of the podcasts under the sun. That's Rewind Live Radio on Global Player. Download it for free from your app store, or just go to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick back at 4. Sheila Fogarty with you now. 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 Sheila Fogarty with you now.